And now, Book TV's live, in-depth program. For the next 3 hours, your opportunity to talk to economist Walter Williams. His most recent book, American Contempt for Liberty, tackles numerous issues, including race, education, the environment, healthcare, and more.
Walter Williams, in your most recent book, American Contempt for Liberty, you write, "It's difficult to be a good economist and simultaneously be perceived as compassionate. To be a good economist, one has to deal with reality. To appear compassionate, often one has to avoid unpleasant questions."
That is absolutely right. I think that to be a good economist, you have to look at cause and effect, and many times people don't want to see cause and effect, and so an economist will always also talk about cost. That is, when people talk about a benefit to doing something, someone has to talk about cost. And a lot of times people don't like to talk about cost.
So is an economist a cold-blooded creature?
No, I don't think so at all. I think I'm a nice person. I think one of my issues, and to help understand me, is my initial premise is that we each own ourselves. That is, I am my private property, and you are your private property. Now, if you accept the idea of self-ownership, then certain acts are moral and certain acts are immoral. And the reason why, let's say, rape is immoral is it violates private property. Murder is immoral. It violates private property, and so is theft. And so I think that you can get a fairly good vision of how the world should be from a moral standpoint, point of view, is to look at the initial premise.
What about the concept of the common good?
Well, the common good, that does make a lot of sense whatsoever. I think that a lot of things have been done in the name of common good. What Hitler did in Germany was done in the name of common good. I think that many horrible acts that we see around the earth, around the world, and over the history of the world has been done in the name of common good and has not been very good, has not been very moral.
Back to your book, American Contempt for Liberty. Many view America's education as a failure, but in at least one important way it's been a success. A success in dumbing down the nation so that we fall easy prey to charlatans, hustlers, and quacks.
I think that is absolutely right. I think that if you just look at, I haven't watched any of the debates, but if you look at some of the debates, and particularly those of on the Democratic side of the spectrum, you find that Americans don't really care about the character of the person and what they're calling for our nation. And I think that's because I think Americans have become dumbed down by the educational system. But there's another success in the educational system, and that is teachers and the people who run the educational system. They have far greater power and fewer accountability standards than they've ever had.
You've spent quite a bit of time writing about America's education system. What's happened to it, in your view?
Well, I think that there's several things that have happened that has not been that don't portend for the good of the system. I think one has been the gross monopolization of education in our country. I believe the number is around in 1950 there were 52,000 school districts in our country. Today, there are about 13,000 school districts. So there's been massive consolidation. I don't think that that's good for our system. And then I think that there are fewer accountability standards, both for students and both for educators. That is, we see that teachers and principals, they get pay raises and promotions whether the kids can read or write, and the kids get their diplomas whether they can read or write. And I think a startling condemnation for the school system is the fact that incoming freshmen in college, they're not ready for college. I think something close to 50% have to take remedial education either in reading, writing, or mathematics. And that's saying that the public schools, they're issuing fraudulent diplomas. That is, they're issuing a diploma that certifies that a kid can read and write at 12th grade level when in fact he cannot.
What do you teach at George Mason?
I teach the theory, economic theory, microeconomic theory. And in the fall, I teach our first PhD course with our incoming PhD students. I teach them the microeconomic theory. And in the spring, I teach an intermediate, which is an undergraduate course in economic theory.
What do you want your students to learn by the time they leave class?
Well, I think if I would love for my students to share my values, but I don't talk about my values in class. What I hope that they gain from my class is to learn how to think. That is, to learn how to engage in dispassionate analysis, and hopefully, if they get out in the world and they get into policy commissions, if they can engage in dispassionate analysis, they can come up with compassionate policies or compassionate ideas.
What kind of education did you have?
Well, I think I tell people, and it's not nice of me to say this, but I tell people that I am very happy that I received virtually all of my education before it became fashionable for white people to like black people. Now, what I mean by that is that when I earned a C in high school or in college, that was a real, honest-to-God C that I earned. And when I earned an A, that was a real, honest-to-God A that I earned. Those people did not care about the legacy of discrimination. They didn't care about my handicaps of being poor. They held me up to standards. And I think that that is very good. And I think that many students, both black and white, are not held up to high standards. For example, in my junior high school, one of our assignments was to write a 3-page essay. And I received my essay back from the teacher on 2 occasions, torn into 4 pieces with a little note on top of it. At least you could spell correctly, rewrite. And so, but if a teacher did that today, the teacher might be in a lot of trouble because she might be hurting the kids' feelings of self-esteem. Well, when I was going to school, teachers didn't give a damn about my self-esteem.
In fact, in your book, Up From the Projects, your autobiography, you write about a Dr. Rosenberg, I believe it was?
Yes.
One of your teachers?
Yes. He was my English teacher in high school, and I thought very highly of him. But and he used to come to school early, and he taught us college tutorial English. You know, that is, those kids who he saw that had some college potential, they would arrive at 7 o'clock in the morning, and he would drill us on English topics and grammar. Anyway, one day in class, what he had the habit of doing, or one of his teaching techniques, was to write a sentence on the board and have one of the students correct the sentence. And so one day he wrote a sentence on the board, and a student found the error in the sentence, and he was about ready to erase the sentence on the board. And I raised my hand and I said, "Dr. Rosenberg, there's another error." And he looked at it and he says, "What is it, Williams?" I said, "Well, there's lack of agreement between the subjective object of the verb to be." And so he said, "Very, very good. You're very, very alert this morning." And so I said to my friend sitting beside me, I said, "Here I'm paying taxes for the teachers to teach me, and I have to teach them." And he heard me. He just went into a tirade. He said, "Williams, teaching you this material is like casting pearls before the swine." He said, "You're never going to be anything." He was really frustrated with me, and legitimately so, because I was a kind of clown in class. But his addressing me that way was the first real challenge that I had in high school, and I ultimately graduated salutatorian, second in my class. But I needed that kind of dressing down. Can you imagine what would happen to a white teacher saying the same things to a black kid today that Dr. Rosenberg said to me, he'd be kicked out of the school. I mean, he'd be called a racist. He'd be condemned for not caring enough about the kids' feelings of self-esteem.
One of your books is called Race and Economics. What does race have to do with economics?
Well, I think there's a lot of confusion between race and economics, but I think that race has played a role in our country in terms of the economic well-being of, let's say, of blacks and or other discriminated against minorities. It has had an effect. But in my book, Race and Economics, I point out one thing is that discrimination does not explain as much as people think that it explains about the problems of race in our country.
And this is from a column in 1997 that you wrote. For years, I've said that if the Ku Klux Klan wanted to sabotage black academic excellence, they couldn't find a tool more effective than the public school systems in most major cities. You were going to junior high at about the time of Brown versus Board of Education, correct?
High school, yes.
High school. Did that affect you at all? Did that change your classes?
No, it didn't. I went to a predominantly black school in North Philadelphia. And as a matter of fact, it was Benjamin Franklin High School. And at the time, Benjamin Franklin High School was the lowest rated school in the city. It was in North Philadelphia, predominantly black and low income area. But however, if you can imagine a time tunnel and you could pull Benjamin Franklin from 1954 up to today, then Benjamin Franklin would be probably one of the highest rated schools in the city of Philadelphia. And that's the reason why, is that standards, educational standards have plummeted so much. Now my statement about the Ku Klux Klan, I've often said that if you wanted to sabotage any chance of black academic excellence, you couldn't find a better way than the public school system in most cities. And what we do see, and that most Americans are unaware of, and particularly black Americans are unaware of, that is the average black high school graduate or the average black high school 12th grader, he has the reading, writing, math, and civics knowledge of the average white 7th or 8th grader. I mean, that is a devastating statistic. That is where a majority of blacks, they graduate from high school with a grossly fraudulent diploma. Now, the quality of education that white students get is nothing to write home about. That is because the standards are very, very low. That is, according to recent National Assessment of Educational Progress statistics for 2015, I think that's only 30 or 40% of white students score proficient in reading and math. But for blacks, it's 7% score proficient in math, and I think like 10% score proficient in reading.
Where do you see the why those disparities in results?
Well, there are probably a number of reasons. One has to do with the education system in general, but I think that one of the things that we have to recognize is that there are many inputs that go into education, and if some of the inputs aren't there, it doesn't make any difference on how much money you spend on education. Education would not occur. In other words, what I'm saying is that for a kid to do well in school, somebody must make sure that the kid is in bed by 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Somebody must get him up in the morning and get him to breakfast. Somebody must make sure he arrives at school on time. Somebody must make sure he does his homework. And somebody must make sure that he minds the teachers. If that is not done, I don't care how much money that you put into the educational budget, education will not occur unless those things are done. And if you ask the question, well, can politicians do those things? Can the President of the United States make sure a kid is in bed on time? Can a mayor or can a congressman or a senator? No. That is, you need a parent. And by the way, I think you need 2 parents.
In your view, when did this start to switch? When did these standards become dualities, and when did the change in education begin, and why?
Well, I think if I were just to try to find a time, I think during the 60s and 70s, standards began to change. Matter of fact, I remember my mother used to complain about the preachings of Dr. Spock, saying that you shouldn't spank your children. Well, regardless of what Dr. Spock advised, I got spanked, And so I think what we started to do, in terms of education, we started to move away from things that worked very well to things that sounded good. That is, we went from things that worked well to doing things that sound good, and things that sounded good they weren't very productive. Matter of fact, one example of this is that I live in a high-income neighborhood in the state of Pennsylvania. But and my wife had been trying to get me to move my daughter out of this fairly good public high school, and I was resisting it because the tuition at the private school was like $14,000 a year. This is back in the 80s. And what convinced me to move her to the private school was a parent-teacher meeting that I had with her teachers. And her math teacher, with all of her teachers, 6 teachers in the room, and along with me, and the math teacher said, well, your daughter has not been turning in her assignments in time. It's been sloppy work, has not been paying attention. I said, well, why didn't you flunk her? We didn't know anything about it. And he said, well, we don't like to flunk the kids. We want the kids to feel good about themselves. And I told him, I said, I feel good about myself every time I solve a set of quadratic equations. And so I went home that evening. I told my wife, let's start looking for a private school.
And did the standards change? Did the teaching
yes.
change?
Matter of fact, one of the things at the private school, we were interviewing several private schools, and the school that we ultimately decided to send my daughter to, the headmistress of the school said, we don't hire education majors. That is, if you teach a course in English, you have to have your degree in English. If you teach a course in math, you have to have your degree in math. And also, if my daughter was slack on some of her jobs, on some of her work, we knew within the next 2 days because they sent an interim report home. And if she did something very well, we would know that as well.
In an interview that you did with the National Review magazine, you say, I'm not a member of any party. I'd call myself a Jeffersonian or Madisonian liberal. We need to take back the word liberal because the people who use it to describe themselves today are not liberal at all. It goes on to say that Williams is in large part a libertarian, what some people call a classical liberal, though he says he splits with many libertarians on national defense and foreign policy, and that he doesn't mind being labeled a conservative.
Well, I've been called a whole lot of things in my nearly 80 years of life. But yes, I think we need to take back the word liberal from liberals because liberal essentially means that you're for personal liberty. And people who call themselves liberals today, they're not for personal liberty. They're for things like using government to forcibly use one American to serve the purpose of another. And they're anything but freedom-oriented.
How did you get from the projects of North Philadelphia to economics professor at George Mason University here in the Washington suburbs?
Well, it was not an easy trip. And you know, one who has gone from where I started to where I am now, you don't do that without luck and chance and help from many other people. And I mean, I'm not a self-made person, but I think that very significant about my journey is that it's a wonderful testament about our nation. That is, just because you know where somebody ended up in life, you can't be sure about where he started. And I think that that is so great about our nation. That's part of the uniqueness of the United States. That is, we're not a class society. That is, in Europe, if you don't start at the top, you're not going to get to the top. But in the United States, it's possible to start at the bottom and move all the way to the top. And very interestingly, if you look at Forbes' list of the 50 or the 100 richest people in the United States, it's not, you don't find the names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, and all these people. You find new money. You find Steve Jobs. You find Bill Gates, and it's relatively there's people who started out with relatively modest incomes or middle class, and they moved to be the richest people in the world. And I think that is a great that's a great commentary about the United States, and it's something that we should work hard to preserve.
Why haven't you watched any of the debates so far?
Well, I'm not turned on by politicians that much. I think that the political world is very, very important, but I think that the politicians are salesmen, and they're trying to sell people on their particular vision, or trying to get people to vote for them, and they'll maybe use any tools at their disposal to get people to vote for them. And I'm just not turned on by politicians.
And in fact, from the Projects, page 128, you write, "It has always been my opinion that, save for a precious few congressmen, these people are not deserving of the honor and respect they receive. I regard most of them, save a handful or so, as enemies of both the Constitution and the moral precepts of our founding fathers."
That is absolutely right. That is, and I think that any politician who would rigorously live up to his oath of office to uphold and defend the United States Constitution, he just would not get elected to office by the American people. Because what politicians reflect, they reflect the values and views of the American people, that is, those who will elect them to office. Now, some people might say, well, gee, Williams, that's a little bit strong. Well, look, we just might ask ourselves, what would happen to a politician who had the vision of, let's say, James Madison, the acknowledged father of the United States Constitution? And in 1794, Congress appropriated $15,000 to help some French refugees. And James Madison stood on the floor of the House irate, and he said, and I'm virtually quoting him, he says, "I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article in the Constitution that authorizes Congress to spend the money of their constituents for the purposes of benevolence." Now, if you look at the federal budget, 2/3 to 3/4 of it is for the purposes of benevolence. Now, you just ask yourself, what would the American people do to a politician or to anybody running for office who would make a statement like Madison did, or make another statement? Madison also said that charity is not a legitimate function of government. Now, can you imagine what the American people would do to a politician who said that? And so what I'm saying is that politicians are reflecting the values and views of the people who elect them to office. And unfortunately, the values and views of most Americans are distinct from those of the founders of our nation.
So, Walter Williams, has the Tea Party movement been a positive in your view in American politics?
Well, I think so. It has been it's been a movement, or it's been a group of people who are saying, well, look, let's go back to the Constitution. Let's have constitutional principles. But whether they'll be successful or not is another matter. And keep in mind that, you know, if you look at the founders of our nation, they wanted very, very limited government. If you read in Madison's in Federalist paper, I think it's 45 or 48, and when he was trying to describe to the citizens of New York what was in the Constitution, to kind of get the citizens of New York to ratify the Constitution, he said that the powers that we delegated to the federal government are few and well-defined and restricted mostly to external affairs. those left with the people and the states are indefinite and numerous. Now, if you turn that upside down, you'd have what we have today. That is, the powers of the federal government are indefinite and numerous, and those of the people in the state are limited and well-defined.
From your book, Liberty versus the Tyranny of Socialism, you write, "We often hear the claim that our nation is a democracy. That wasn't the vision of the founders. They saw democracy as another form of tyranny. If we've become a democracy, I guarantee you that the founders would be deeply disappointed by our betrayal of their vision."
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. If you read the statements by Madison, Jefferson, and Adams, they condemn the idea of democracy. Matter of fact, you don't find the term democracy in any of our founding documents. That is, you don't find the word democracy in the Declaration of Independence. You don't find the word democracy anywhere in the United States Constitution. And if the listeners want further convincing of this, when we talk about when we pledge allegiance to the flag, is it to the democracy for which it stands, or the republic, or the song during the War of 1861? It was the battle hymn of the democracy or the battle hymn of the republic. Now, the founders thought that the idea of majority rule was a form of tyranny, and if you look at the Constitution, if you read the Constitution represents our rules of the game. It's a very it's an anti-majoritarian document. That is, the president is not elected by a majority vote. The president can veto the wishes of 535 people of Congress, and it takes 2/3 to override his veto. So there are many anti-majoritarian aspects of the United States Constitution, which represents our rules of the game.
In 2010, and this is from your book, American Contempt for Liberty, you write, "Early indications suggest that the Barack Obama presidency might turn out to be similar to the failed presidency of Jimmy Carter."
Yes, and what some people are saying, President Obama is making Jimmy Carter's presidency look good. I think that our enemies around the world, they don't have a lot of respect for us, and our friends don't have a lot of trust in us, and I think that that at least the foreign diplomacy part of his presidency has been a disaster. And I think that the domestic aspect of it, with the socialized medicine under Obamacare, and the bailouts, big business bailouts, and spending programs, I think that's been a disaster for our country, and it'll take a long time for us to recover.
One of the things we're talking about this election season is income inequality.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you?
Well, it doesn't mean very much to me. I think that one of the points that we have to talk about when we talk about income inequality, we should be talking about productive inequality. That is, you very seldom find highly productive people poor. The people that you find poor tend to have low productivity. But then again, the whole idea of income inequality ignores ignores the fact that there's all kinds of income mobility in our country. Just for example, a lot of people look at the lower quintile of the income distribution. They look at it as if that the people in the lower quintile are permanent residents there. It turns out that there are several important studies, or at least two important studies, one by the University of Michigan and one by the IRS, shows that up to 91% of people in the lowest fifth of income distribution leave that, or 91% leave that quintile in 10 years. And matter of fact, the people in the top 1%, 30% of them are not there anymore after 10 years. So there's a lot of income mobility, and so we should not assume that these different quintiles represent permanent residence for people. They're just they're statistical categories.
Back to American Contempt for Liberty. President Obama and the Democratic Party harp about tax fairness. Here's my fairness question to you. What standard of fairness dictates that the top 10% of income earners pay 71% of the federal income tax burden, while 47% of Americans pay absolutely nothing?
Yeah, that's a reasonable question. Should the top 10% or top 25% pay all the federal income tax and others pay nothing? But I think there's even a more insidious problem about people not paying any income taxes. That is, the people who have no federal income tax burden or liability, they become natural constituents for big spending politicians. After all, if you don't have a tax liability, what do you care about taxes? And matter of fact, that points out why the so-called Bush tax cuts during the Bush presidency weren't that popular. Because again, if you're not paying much taxes, well then what do you care about a tax cut? And matter of fact, you may view a tax cut as a threat to your handout programs.
So in your view, was Mitt Romney right when he said that 47% is never going to vote for me?
Well, the empirical evidence suggests that he was right.
Good afternoon and welcome to Book TV on C-SPAN 2. This is our monthly in-depth program. Our guest this month is author, economics professor, columnist Walter Williams. And he will be with us for the next 2.5 hours to take your calls and your comments via social media. Here's how you can get a hold of us. If you would like to make a comment or have a question for Walter Williams, 202 is the area code, 748-8200. If you live in the East and Central time zones, 202-748-8201 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Now, we got several ways via social media to get a hold of us as well. We're going to begin with our email, and that is booktv@cspan.org. So you can email Dr. Williams questions there. You can also make a comment on our Twitter page, @BookTV. Facebook, facebook.com/booktv. We've got Walter Williams posted to the top of our page there, and you can go ahead and make a comment along with the other folks who have made comments down there. Quite a conversation going on our Facebook page right now. Now, we've also got another way. If you want to send a text message, you can send a text message to Dr. Williams at 202-717-9684. That's 202-717-9684, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. That's probably the first time that I've ever read that little script and not said 202, because I know that's a pet peeve of yours. I read that somewhere, so I used the zero, and my mom says the same thing. Okay, so that's the first time I've ever used the zero there. It's a little more difficult. Here's Dr. Williams' books over the years. The State Against Blacks came out in 1982. America, A Minority Viewpoint, also in 1982. All It Takes Is Guts, 1987. South Africa's War Against Capitalism, 1989. Do the Right Thing, The People's Economist Speaks. More Liberty Means Less Government, 1997. Liberty versus the Tyranny of Socialism came out in 2008. Up from the Projects, an autobiography, came out in 2010. Race and Economics, How Much Can Be Blamed on Discrimination, came out in 2011. And his latest collection came out this year, American Contempt for Liberty. Dr. Williams, I want to go back to your second to last book. How much can be blamed on discrimination when it comes to race and economics and the disparities that we see currently in the nation?
Well, I think one of the things we should recognize is that many things that we're seeing in black communities, those things that we're seeing in black communities, such as Ferguson and Baltimore and others, they are entirely new among black Americans. That is, the illegitimacy rate among black Americans is close to 75%. And a lot of people will blame this on a legacy of discrimination, but it turns out in 1938, the illegitimacy rate was 11% among blacks. And matter of fact, among whites, it was 3% in 1938, and today among whites is around 30%. If you look at they break down the black family, and matter of fact, maybe breakdown is a poor term to use. The black family does not form in the first place. That is, only 30-some% of black kids live in two-parent families. Again, many people will blame that on a legacy of discrimination, but turns out in 1880s, the 75% of black kids lived in two-parent families. In New York in 1925, 85% of black kids lived in two-parent families. The kind of crime that we see in many black neighborhoods is entirely new. I grew up in the Richtown Housing Project in North Philadelphia, and we didn't go to bed to the sounds of gunshots. And many people, they did not lock their door until 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night when everybody was home. There was far greater civility in poor black neighborhoods at a time when black people were closer to slavery, only 2 or 3 generations out of slavery, and there were not the opportunities, and there's far greater discrimination against blacks as we find today. So what I'm arguing is that much of what we see has absolutely nothing to do with discrimination. If you look at, the fact of business, which is not very pleasant to talk about, if you ask the question, in what cities do black people are black people most insecure, receive the grossly poor education, and have other very, very poor living standards, they are in the very cities where a black is the mayor, a black is the chief of police, black is the superintendent of school, and the very cities where the administration has, in those cities, have been Democrat for half a century. So I'm not stating a causal relationship between blacks being in political control of these cities and the poor living conditions and the poor standards in school. But what I'm saying is that you can't blame it on discrimination. That is, the rotten education that black kids are receiving in Washington, D.C., no way in the world can you blame that on racial discrimination when the political mechanism in Washington, D.C. is black, unless you want to say that the black politicians are engaging in racial discrimination and oppressing their people. So I think that when you begin to try to solve problems, you have to identify the causes correctly. That is, for example, I could be a physician, and you come to me and you say you have a bad stomach ache. And I can say, well, your stomach ache is caused by your ingrown toenails. Well, if there's no relationship between your ingrown toenails and your stomach ache, I can treat your ingrown toenails all that one, and you're still going to have the stomach ache. And the same thing with trying to help people out. That is, if you have to identify the causes of their problems correctly. And if you just say, well, look, black problems are caused by a legacy of discrimination and a legacy of slavery and discrimination, well, you can work on that all you want, and the black problems are going to persist.
How long have you written your column? How many times a week?
Well, I've written a column. I started out with the Philadelphia Tribune, which is a black newspaper. And it runs, and I think it print my column once every 2 weeks. So this is like in 1976 or 78. And then I became syndicated in 1980, 1981. And so I've been writing a column for close to 40 years. And my column allows me to do those things that I can't do in classroom. That is, the kind of discussion that you see me when I'm on the radio or on television, or in our discussion right now, they never come up in my classroom, because I think that it's academic dishonesty for professors to use their classrooms to proselytize students. And once in a while I get a student who'll ask me a question about something I've written in a column, and I'll just tell them, well, see me after class, or come during my office hours, because I refuse to proselytize students. I think it's academic dishonesty.
What's the first thing you say when you go into class that first day with a new bunch?
Well, in my intermediate course, the first thing I tell the students, I say, this is a real college course. you're going to be expected to start sentences off with capital letters, find a subject, object, and a verb and a period. And if this is too challenging, you should drop the course. And I also tell the students, my class is at 7:30 in the morning. On my intermediate class is 7:30 in the morning on Tuesday and Thursday, and in the spring. And I tell the students, part of my lesson on the first day, or part of my statements on the first day of class, I tell them the class starts at 7:30 on cold days in February. It starts at 7:30, and when the sun is out and the birds are chirping, you just like to stay in bed. In April, it starts at 7:30. So if the class is too early for you, you ought to drop it now.
Does it sell out?
Well, the class is almost always full.
I want to show a little bit of video here, and you'll understand what this is. It's a friend of yours. Let's see this.
People from time to time ask me to mention some black conservative writers. And I tell them, 30 years ago, I could have told you Walter Williams and me. And today, I can't even keep track of them all. They're all over the place. They're in the media. They have their own shows. They write columns. They write books. And I learn about them, from nowhere they suddenly appear. So there is this counter trend going on. And everything depends upon which wins out in the end.
How much of a role have you played in guiding them, the conservative black writers?
I have no way of knowing. You'd have to ask them. Most of the people who sometimes I'm credited with having influenced this person or that person, but Walter Williams, for example, had arrived at the same conclusion that I had before I ever met him, and in fact, that was his whole reason for wanting to meet me. So that it's so easy to reconstruct these things to fit some notion, but it's what I call putting two and two together and getting seven. That Walt had his own ideas before I ever came along.
That was from 2005. Who was that?
That was Dr. Tom Sowell, my very good, longtime friend and colleague. We met at UCLA in 1969, and he came out as a visiting professor in 1969. I believe in 1970 he joined the faculty, and I never took a class from him, but we became instantaneous friends. And I think some of our friendship began when he called me up and he says, "Walter, I just got some royalties on a new book, and would you like to go see the Muhammad Ali fight?" That was when Muhammad Ali came out in retirement and he fought Frazier, and that was the fight that he lost against Joe Frazier. And we've been friends ever since. And we think very much alike, but we're not twins in terms of our thinking.
What about his comment that he can't count the black conservative writers anymore? There's so many.
Well, yeah, back in the 70s, Tom Sowell, we were working on a project at Hoover at the Urban Institute, and he was telling me, he said, if we wanted to have a pinochle game among black conservatives, it would have to be cutthroat. We couldn't play partnership because there wouldn't be that many. And also, Bill Buckley, he joked one time, he says that Tom Sowell, the EPA does not allow Tom Sowell and Walter Williams to fly on the same plane because if the plane crashed, there would be no more conservative economists. But today, there are many, many people who are black people who are libertarian conservative, and I think that maybe we're proud to say that at least I'm proud to say that some of their inspiration to challenge conventional wisdom came from the writings of me and Tom Sowell.
What's your relationship with Rush Limbaugh?
Well, I just do the show. I've laid eyes on him only twice, even though I've done this show for 20 years. And the reason why...
And you've guest hosted.
Yeah, I've guest hosted for 20 years. And the reason why I don't see him, because the reason I'm in New York to do the show is because he's not there, as he's somewhere else. So we've only seen each other twice, but over the years he lets me have the show, and it's my show. It's just like I own the show, and so and I'm always pleased to have very very good guests, and I've interviewed Tom Sowell a number of times on his books when he was on the show, and I looked at Rush Limbaugh's show as my big classroom. That was my 6 million student classroom, and I could also express ideas on the show that I could not express in class.
Walter Williams, this is a Facebook comment from Trevor Coleman. Williams, Thomas Sowell, Clarence Thomas, and Ben Carson are right-wing bigots, favorite colored people because they absolved them of any responsibility for the racism they instituted and maintain in this society. And of course, in spite of individual successes, African Americans still have to navigate structural barriers to success and profound and relentless white privilege most whites don't even have to think about.
Well, I think that's a very, very unfortunate view of blacks in our country. And that is, if you, I think it's clear that black Americans have made the greatest gains over some of the highest hurdles in the shortest period of time than any other racial group in the history of mankind. Now, why would I say that? Well, if you added up the amount of income that black Americans earn and you thought of black Americans as a separate nation, we would rank 17th or 18th richest nation on the face of the earth. There are few black Americans who are among the world's richest people. There was one black American who was the head of the world's mightiest military, Colin Powell. There are some black Americans who are the world's most famous personalities. Now, the significance of all this is that in 1865, neither a slave nor a slave owner would have believed that these kind of gains would be possible in just a little bit over a century. And as such, it speaks to the intestinal fortitude of a people, but just as importantly, it speaks to the greatness of a nation. Now, the task that lies before us is how can we get these gains to a large percentage of black community, maybe 1/3, for whom these gains appear to be elusive. And so that's the real challenge. But the point is that anybody who would betray black people as poor and downtrodden, I think that is a racial insult.
Well, we've got calls waiting. Walter Williams is our guest, and Bob in Denville, New Jersey, you are the first caller. Hi, Bob.
Hey, how are you?
Go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, I'm enjoying the conversation very much. I'd be interested for an opinion on, Dr. Williams brought up Madison. I'm wondering if he's familiar with Richard Beeman's book, Plain Honest Men.
No, I'm not.
Well, in it, he describes, I guess the shift from what would be considered a principle of federalism to one of more of a national supreme government in light of Shays' Rebellion, I guess General Washington's troops that were threatening to march on Philadelphia for lack of payment. And over time, there became an understanding that a stronger centralized government really was critical to our nation's survival. Hamilton felt that way, Morris felt that way, others felt that way, and that it really, constitutionally is not necessarily an issue of black and white, because there has to be a partnership between the federal government as well as the states on an ongoing basis, and that remains today. And I'm not arguing with principles of conservatism, but I'm asking you, do you recognize the need on a continual basis for a public-private partnership between the centralized federal government as well as the states and as well as private enterprise? That's one question I have, and I wonder if I could have a follow-up later.
Well, tell you what, we've got a lot of callers waiting, so let's have Dr. Williams respond to that, and we'll move on.
Well, I think one of the issues is that the important issue is that it is not whether something is a good idea or a bad idea. The question is it permissible by the United States Constitution? And much of what the federal government does is not permissible by the United States Constitution. And the Constitution calls for limited government, limited powers of the federal government. And as I said, I gave the Madison quote. I said that in Federalist Paper 45, he said that the powers of the federal government are few and well defined and restricted mostly to external affairs. And those of the people in the states are indefinite and numerous. Now, I would like to see where we've changed the Constitution to say, well, the federal government has unlimited powers, and those powers held by the people in the states are indeed limited. So what we've done, we've made changes in the Constitution without having a constitutional convention, without having a constitutional amendment. And indeed, the framers were wise. They gave us Article 5 as a means to amend the Constitution, but we do things now and we say the heck with the Constitution. And I think that that's a big mistake.
And in your book, Liberty versus the Tyranny of Socialism, you quote Tom Paine, "Government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil in its worst state and intolerable."
That is absolutely right. And I think that we Americans should recognize that the history of mankind has been that of arbitrary abuse and control by others. The founders were not perfect, but they tried to move us away from that. And the main enemy of mankind throughout its history has been government. That is, if you look at the 20th century, it's the most brutal century in the history of mankind. I think that something like 60 million people lost their lives in wartime, but that pales in comparison to the number of people who were murdered by their own government. And the number comes up to somewhere close to 100 million people are murdered by their own government. And matter of fact, these statistics are documented in a book called Death by Government. And so it shows that it's a strong argument that that government is the enemy of mankind. Matter of fact, the framers of our Constitution recognized that. Just look at the language of the Bill of Rights. It says things like, Congress shall not abridge, Congress shall not prohibit, Congress shall not disparage, Congress shall not infringe. Now, if the framers did not think that Congress would do these things, why in the world would they put them in? Why would they put that down in the Constitution? And I've suggested to people that when we die, and if at our next destination we see anything like a Bill of Rights, we know that we're in hell. Because a Bill of Rights in heaven would be an affront to God. It would be saying, well, we can't trust God, you know. And so the framers recognized that the enemy of mankind was government, but they recognized that we do need some government. And as Thomas Paine was pointing out, that the government is under the best of conditions of the necessary evil. And matter of fact, the whole Second Amendment argument about guns, the right to keep and bear arms, most Americans think that the framers gave us the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, wanted to protect our right to keep and bear arms. They think that it was for deer and duck hunting. But the framers actually come out and say to allow Americans to have some kind of defense against abuse of government. And people like Hamilton said things like to allow the American people to protect themselves against their representatives if they are betrayed by their representatives. And who in the world are their representatives? It's the United States Congress. So I think that the framers held a great distrust for government that Americans today, I think we love government. That is, the average American loves government, and the reason why the average American loves government is because government can do those things for them that if they did the same thing privately, they would go to jail. That is, government can take my money and give it to you, but if you came up to me with a gun and took my money, you would go to jail. But if you go to Congress and ask them, would you take William's money and give it to me? Well, you know, you don't go to jail, but you have my money.
And I should have said this earlier, but if you do text in a message for Walter Williams, if you could include your first name and your city so that we can identify you that way. But this is a text without first name and city. Is the welfare system intrinsically intended to keep poor people, mainly of color, in poverty?
I don't think that is intrinsically intended. I don't think that's the intention. I think that the intention for well-intended people, I think, is to help people. But I think that when you look at the intentions of programs, when you look at programs, you should ignore their intentions and ask, what is the effect? And I think that the effect of welfare has been devastating for Black Americans. The kind of things you see among Black Americans today are entirely new, as I said earlier, and there's no more material poverty in the United States. There's no more material poverty. We don't have anything like you see in Bangladesh and Afghanistan and all these other poor countries. What we have in our country is poverty of the spirit. That is where people have become dependent on government programs, and they're not self-sufficient. That's the kind of poverty that we have today.
Tommy, Texas City, Texas. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Yes, my question, I have four things I'd like to ask Mr. Williams. In the 1950s, well, it wasn't until the 1950s, my understanding is that Black people in this country were not considered human beings until then. The next thing is that the Ku Klux Klan has been a hate organization for years, and no government official have ever approached them. No police department have ever really done anything that would be effective to get rid of such a group. And the third thing is Black Lives Matter movement. And the fourth thing is that integration. I don't think, from when I was coming up, that Black people wanted to go to school with white people. Black people wanted their own. They wanted a level playing field. And integration seemed like integration today, what it has caused Black people in this country to lose their foundation, because that was a time when my mother could see another kid doing wrong, and she would discipline that kid and take that kid to his or her parent. We lost that. We lost our teachers, which would govern and watch over us and would report to our parents when we was not acting correctly in school. In integration, when integration took place, the white teachers were scared. It was like it was a standoff. There was no communication. There was always fear and tension between Black students and white teachers.
Tommy, very quickly before we get Walter Williams to answer, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where were you raised? How old are you? And if you could also clarify your remark on the Black Lives Movement.
Okay, I was raised in Dallas, and my first encounter with the system, when I say the system, police officer, I was 9. And
what year was that?
I'm 50. I'm 64 now.
Thank you.
And that was back in the 50s, back in 1958, 59. That's the way they did back then. They would come in and intimidate you when you were young. I mean, very young. Get you under control. But that's one incident with an officer that I consider to be racist and a bigot. But my experiences with police officers has not always been bad. I've had some that had the right to arrest me, but they didn't. They gave us a chance. They sent us home to our parents.
Tommy, very quickly, what did you say about the Black Lives Matter movement?
Okay, this is why I'm so interested in the Black Lives Matter movement. when I was 19, I was shot 6 times by my stepfather. Now, this is black and black-on crime. The reason I'm interested in the Black Lives Matter movement is because I don't think anything has really changed. And these young people, which is our children now, they have heard over and over what the politicians had to say. And these politicians go to Washington. They've been going to Washington ever since the 60s. And we're finding out that really is nothing done because the black community is still suffering. It's still doing the same thing that it was done before we were declared as human beings in this country.
All right, Tommy, I think we got a lot of information. Thanks for your time this afternoon. Walter Williams.
Well, yeah, he doesn't have any specific questions, but I would comment on the, let's say, the Black Lives Matter. For example, if you say, well, look, this year there'll be 8,000 blacks who are murdered in the United States. And if you say, well, look, maybe cops shot and killed 200, well, it would not make a very significant difference in the number of blacks who are murdered in this year. One of the tragic things about the crime problem in the many black neighborhoods is that 51 or 2% of homicide victims in the United States are black. And it turns out that somewhere around 94, 95% of them are murdered by another black. And so if you focus attention on what police are doing or what white people are doing, you will not deal with the problem of black lives being destroyed on the streets because most of them are done by murdered by blacks. So I don't quite understand the Black Lives Matter movement. And if you ask these people, look, okay, let's make the heroic assumption that cops murdered 500 blacks. Well, still you're talking about overwhelming percentage of blacks were murdered by other blacks. So what are you going to do about that? And if you just focus your attention on blacks who are shot by policemen, you just missed the boat. That is the murder rate will continue.
From our Facebook page, Tony Nunez. He is very selective and uses numbers to fit his ideology without looking at all the facts. He is a good house slave selling the pro-right-wing agenda that supports the top 1% and blames minorities for the situation they have been put in.
Well, that's the kind of thinking that's requirement for the continuance of what we see today. It's just pointing the finger at places that are irrelevant to the problems, and we just don't get anywhere that way. That is, if he wants to blame. He says, oh, you blame rich people, blame the top 1% for these rotten schools that black kids go to. Okay, so you round up the 1% that are rich and you take all their money, take their houses. What in the world is it going to do for a black kid in high school, graduating from high school in Washington, D.C., that can't read and write at the 7th grade level? What is it going to do for him? Won't do anything. But it might make some politicians, it might make some do-gooders feel good.
Michael is calling in from Fayette, Alabama. Michael, you're on with Walter Williams.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much. I'm really, how can I say it, honored to have this privilege of asking a question of Walter Williams. Before I get into my question...
No, Michael, I apologize. We hear from you once a month, and if you could get right to your question, that would be great.
All right. I want, how can I say it? It's about the way that campaigning politicians, talk radio hosts, and think tank lobbies, founders, and their other spokespeople broadly, glibly use the words freedom and liberty, and how Washington involvement in the economy is going to somehow take away our freedoms and liberties, which the Constitution protects. I'm not standing up for President Obama at all. But even though I'm a white male, as a born-again saved Christian with both a mental illness and a very rare birth autism, that's one reason I talk too much. I don't see how those who are impoverished through no fault of their own, civilians in the third world, especially where there are civil wars, children born into poverty, and handicapped people, if Washington provides assistance to United Way agencies, federal works projects such as public buildings, public schools, and all that.
You know what, Michael? I think we got the point. The importance to Michael of Washington helping out those less fortunate or those that can't do for themselves.
Well, I believe that it's praiseworthy and laudable for people to help their fellow man. I think it's praiseworthy and laudable to help your fellow man by reaching into your own pockets to do so. I think that is worthy of condemnation to help your fellow man by reaching into somebody else's pockets. And I think for the Christians among us, when God gave Moses the commandment, thou shalt not steal, he did not mean thou shalt not steal unless you got a majority vote in Congress.
Errol, Tacoma, Washington. Please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you. First of all, Professor, congratulations on still being around. You've been around a long time. You as a clear thinking individual, you have two distinct disadvantages. First of all, you expect people to think like you when given the same facts or come to the same conclusions, and then you think you're right in all things. But you're at Trinity College, 1980 so. I had the pleasure. I was president of NAACP at Urban League at that time, and I went to hear you. And you changed my life because whether I wanted to accept it or not, you were factually correct. I mean, you gave a statistic that the group has received more federal assistance than anybody else is the American Indian or Native Indian, Native Americans, yet they have more of the problems of society than anyone. You made some recommendations that night. I don't know if you remember them all.
I might not.
You made some recommendations that if we would do certain things, we would be successful. But the key, and I will close this up very quickly, the key is you said something about politics, and I'm apolitical. I'm a Christian. I believe in doing things. Here, they had an election about 8 years ago where it was a white male against a black female, and the white male, I came in, I just moved to the area, and his credentials are incredible. 20 years of working and et cetera, et cetera. So I end up, and the other party said nothing about what they think or what they believe, except they represented the black race. And as a black person, I took the other person because what I fought for, and I'm sure you fought for, is that race should not be a determining factor as who should be a power, who we should elect, but on qualifications. But what's surprising is, and I was very clear working,
Carol, can you get to the point?
Yes. I told them that by me working for a white person, is the same as we would want whites to vote for a black person. And that...
All right, we're going to leave it there. Did you get anything you want to respond to out of Errol's comments?
Well,
I'm not sure what he was going for.
Well, when he was talking, I was thinking that about the lecture that I gave, I think at Trinity College some years ago. One of my objectives when I give lectures, or generally when I talk to people, I don't try to get people to necessarily think like I do, although I'd be happy if they did. But my objective is to try to get people to challenge conventional wisdom. That is, I give them some ideas which would enable them to challenge conventional wisdom and then reach their own conclusions. But I never try to say to people, I want you to think the way I do. Although, again, I would like for them to do it, but I give them some evidence to cause them to question things that they hadn't questioned previously.
You write, for most of my professional life, I've traveled frequently, sometimes boarding a commercial flight 2, 3, or 4 times a month for lucrative speaking engagements. Over the past 3 years, the frequency has fallen to an average of once or twice a year. The reason is simple. I don't want to be arrested or detained for questioning some of the senseless airport security procedures. Don't get me wrong, I'm for security, but against stupidity.
Yeah, well, I have a very low tolerance for the TSA people. I think this was a number of years ago, but one time I was traveling, and I had carry-on luggage, and in my carry-on luggage I had an eyeglass repair kit. And this TSA person told me I could take the screws, but I could not take the screwdriver. And I said, that's stupid as hell. I said, who ever heard of somebody hijacking an airplane with an eyeglass screwdriver? And so he said, wait here. And so his superintendent came up, and the superintendent asked me, and I repeated myself. He said, it's on the list. Either leave it here or you don't get on the plane. And so I would not have gotten on the plane, but the people that invited me had set up a banquet and things like that, and it would have been pretty awful if I hadn't shown up. But I just shown up. But I just don't travel commercially anymore, and now I just travel on the private plane. If people want to have me to give a talk, and it's a very costly proposition, I just will go by a private plane. I just won't deal with the TSA because I'm too old to go to jail, and I'm not as compliant as most of my fellow Americans.
But you have been in jail.
Yes, I.
How many times have you been arrested?
I think I've spent 3 nights in jail. And matter of fact, my stepfather, he used to joke. He said, you know, you're not a real citizen unless you spent time in jail. And one time, my first time in jail, I was a taxi cab driver at the time. And I was driving down the street, and there was a cop standing in the middle of the street for no obvious reason to me. And I learned out later he was holding a parking spot for his buddy. And so I asked him, did he want me for anything? He just ignored me. And I said, look, if you don't want me for anything, get out of my way. And so he came up to the cab and asked me to repeat myself, and I'd repeat it. So he yanked me out of the cab and told my customer, who I wanted as a witness, to be on his way lest he get charged with interfering with arrest. And so so I was taken to jail, and he kneed me in the groin, and I was really in pain. I was initially charged with disorderly conduct and resisting arrest, and when I got back from the doctor, another charge had been levied, assault and battery on the police officer. That was to provide cover for him. And so I spent a night in jail, and then the next time I went to jail was again, I was driving a taxi cab, and I came to pick up my wife. She was not my wife at the time. She was my girlfriend, at her sister's house, and they had a loud, rowdy party there. And the police came to the house. This is in North Philadelphia. And my wife's sister's husband, really big guy, he picked up 2 cops and threw them out on the street and sicked his German Shepherds on them. And so they called for backup and the arrest of all of them. And I asked the officer who was placing me on the arrest, I said, what are you arresting me for? I just got here. And so he says, we're arresting you for frequenting a disorderly house. And then the third time, I was married, and we're in Los Angeles, and I had an argument with my wife. And so I just got up and I walked out of the house, and around 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, to walk off my anger. And I was walking along, and so the policeman stopped me. He asked me, what am I doing? And so I said, I'm taking a walk. He said, this far from home? He asked me where I live, and I said, I'm taking a walk. So he said, this far from home? I said, yes, I think you guys ought to walk once in a while yourselves. And so that remark made him call in the station to get, check my records. And it turned out, this was in Los Angeles, it turned out that about 4 or 5 years ago, from that time, I got a parking ticket that I didn't pay, and a warrant was issued for my arrest, and so they had to arrest me. And the worst thing about it is that I had to call my wife, who I just had an argument with, to come down and bail me out. I think the bail was something like $50 or $75, something like that. So.
Did she come down to the station?
Yes, yeah, and I got a lecture too.
Who was Connie?
I met Connie when I was driving a cab in Philadelphia, and we used to go to speakeasies at that time in Philadelphia or in Pennsylvania. They had blue laws, and bars had to close on 12 o'clock on Saturday night, and so a bunch of us cab drivers and some of their wives and girlfriends, we would meet at this luncheonette across the street, and then we'd go out to speakeasies, and maybe 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And Connie had just started dating this guy who was a friend, this cab driver who was a friend of mine, and I was talking to her before he got in, and so matter of fact, I gave her my phone number. I said, "Why don't you call me once in a while?" She later said she thought I was being pretty arrogant, and so because girls back then didn't call guys, and so she eventually called me to meet a girlfriend of hers, and then I met her. I went to the house and met a girlfriend. She asked me would I give her a drive home, and we became friends, and we were married. When she passed away in 2007, we were married almost 48 years, and together 50 years. And some people, during our long marriage, some people congratulate us on having been married so long, and I say, no, congratulations is not in order. We're just both of us are just apathetic. We can do better, I can do better, and she can do better, but we're just too lazy to try.
Who's Devin?
Pardon me?
Who's Devin?
She's my daughter. And I wanted 5 children, and my wife did not want any. And the reason why I didn't want any, because she was the I think the 10th of the last of 10 children, and she was obliged to take care of her nieces and nephews, and she did not want any children. So after we were married 14 years, we finally did have a daughter, and so we settled with one. But then again, I kind of got even with Mrs. Williams, because when my daughter went away to college, sometimes I'd go downstairs, to get a water or to get another glass of wine, and she'd be sitting watching TV with tears in her eyes. And I would tell her, if you had had 5 children, we would not have had an empty nest. So you're to blame for your sadness.
What's Devin doing today?
Well, she teaches high school history and AP history, I believe. Yeah.
Private or public school?
It's private school. Yeah.
Richard, Maitland, Florida. Thanks for holding. You're on with author, columnist, Professor Walter Williams.
Hi, Professor Williams.
Hi. Hi.
Hi. Well, as I've been on hold here for a while, I've got about a dozen more comments to make, so I need about an hour. Is that possible?
Sure. Go ahead. I'm gonna go get some more coffee, and you just go ahead and take over.
Okay, great. A lot of what you're saying is true, but I'd just like to give some contrary. And you mentioned being able to think, I guess, change your conventional thinking, which I'm a big believer in. I think that's one of the biggest problems we have is people take these big assumptions and can't really examine and think. And I would challenge you to do the same. I do agree with a lot of what you're saying. However, big government, yes, it's a problem. And one of the major reasons, it is controlled by largely the wealthy, big money. We have socialism for defense contractors, oil companies, big ag, pharmaceutical companies. So when we look at the money, sure, poor people, but who stands up for poor people? And you know what? Not everyone is going to be an entrepreneur. What I would like to see is a country that recognizes that that janitor that works hard, if he's working hard, should he be able to put a roof over his family's house, and feed his family and have medical care?
All right, Richard, I think we got your point. Walter Williams.
Well, I think that one of the caller talks about wealth and the handouts to big business and others in Washington. And I think that the problem is not necessarily money in Washington. I think that the problem is the power of Congress to do favors for people. That is to give one American a privilege that will be denied another American. And so, of course, people are going to be willing to pay for that. And so, but however, what we need to do, we need to strip Congress of that kind of power to play favorites with different Americans. And so you would not find money come to Washington. That is, people not say, let's say various PACs and political organizations, they're not giving money to Congress for congressmen to uphold and defend the United States Constitution. They're giving money to Congress because they want special favors. They want access. And I think that is the big problem with our system, and that's the big problem with a lot of the graft that goes on in Congress, and giving like the Export-Import Bank that gives huge handouts to Boeing and to other competitors and I think one of the things we have to recognize is that the only way Congress can give one American citizen $1 is to first, through intimidation, threats, and coercion, confiscate that dollar from some other American. And so, I agree with the caller in the following sense that we need to do something about these handouts that Congress is giving out, and I think that we need to do it down the line. Handouts in general. Keep in mind, when people say, well, Williams, we just have to have food stamps or people will starve. And I say, well, look, when the poor Irish were fleeing the potato famine in the 1840s, arriving in New York without, with just the clothing on their back, how in the world did they make? What was their food stamp program? Well, of course there wasn't. And people say we need this program and that program. And I say, how in the world did we make it? We become a rich nation without all these programs. Or think of another area. People say, well, government ought to do something about the inflation, or government ought to do something about the recession or depression. It turns out that from 1787 until about 1930, the federal government, we had recessions and depressions, so they call them panics, and nobody thought that the federal government ought to intervene to correct the economy. It wasn't until the Hoover administration and later the Roosevelt administration that people thought that government should get involved to try to correct the economy, and as a result, they created the longest depression that we ever had. That is, during the entire 1930s, I doubt whether the unemployment rate went below 20%, and it wasn't until after World War II that we solved some of the problems with the depression. And so, in general, you're hard put for finding out some good things done by government, except that of protecting individual liberties and individual rights.
Lloyd, calling in from St. Louis. Hi, Lloyd.
Hello, how are you?
How are you?
Real good, thanks. Hello?
We are listening. Lloyd, you got to go ahead and just make your comment or ask your question.
Oh, yes. Okay, for the dear professor, this is what I'd like to ask him about. The 3/5 clause and also the Founding Fathers who were slaveholders, and also what about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments? And I'll stop there and I'll hang up, and I'm looking forward to hearing the professor's comments to those things, because he keeps talking about the Founding Fathers. If it just turned on them, he would still be in slavery.
And Lloyd, before we get an answer, just give us a brief snapshot of yourself.
Okay, first of all, I'm a retired school teacher and also an attorney. and I went to what you call an all colored high school, and but at any rate, we had a good foundation. I graduated in January '53, and my integration was the military and college. And during that generation, they produced a lot of outstanding black folks. We were called colored then. And but anyway, I'll stop and I'll hang up. And I'm looking forward to hearing the professor's response to those different things. I appreciate it.
And this is something you write about, which is the Founding Fathers and the issue of slavery.
Yes, and I think that the 3/5 clause that people talk about, the blacks being seen as 3/5 of a person. It turned out that during the 1787 convention in Philadelphia, it turned out that slaves were 40% of the population of the southern states. The southern states wanted to count each person, each slave, as one vote. The northern delegates to the convention, they didn't think that slaves should be counted at all in terms of the apportionment for the House of Representatives. And so the concession they made was to make blacks count, the slaves count as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of apportionment to the House of Representatives. Now, the caller, I don't know whether he would want this, would he argue on the side of the southern states to count each black as one vote, which if they were counted as one vote, it would give the southern states far greater power in the United States Congress. Now, many of the founders, they did not want. They were against slavery, but they did not. They felt that if they had abolished slavery during the convention, then there would not have been a union. And so one has to ask the question, would blacks have been better off if the North went their way and the South went their way, and there was not a union created between, we did not become a United States? I don't think so. I would disagree that blacks would have been better off under those conditions. And matter of fact, I think it was Wilson, one of the delegates, I believe from New Jersey, he said something, at least we've outlawed slavery, the slave trade, by 1808, and that might be a very good start for outlawing altogether. Now, in terms of the founders' vision of slavery, I have many, many quotations from the founders, including George Washington, James Madison, George Mason, Thomas Jefferson, et cetera, that condemn the idea of slavery. But I think that there's one thing that we have to recognize, and again, this is not giving any moral sanction to slavery, is that throughout mankind's history, slavery has been the normal state of affairs. And it turns out that blacks were the last people to be enslaved. That is, matter of fact, the term slave comes from it's a reference to the Slavic people. That is, Slavs were among some of the first slaves. And matter of fact, white Americans were enslaved, and that's why Jefferson sent troops to Tripoli to free American slaves that were enslaved by some of the northern African countries. And so I think that the unique thing about slavery in the United States and slavery in the United States is that, or in the Western world, I should say, is that Great Britain and the United States were the two countries that went to the greatest pains to eliminate slavery. That is, Great Britain banned the slave trade. Just the sight of the Union Jack on the high seas, that kind of ended the trade of slavery. And then Americans, we fought a very, very costly war. But 600,000 Americans died, and part of the effort was to eliminate slavery. So I think there's two things we have to recognize. Slavery was the normal state of affairs with mankind. And again, I'm not giving any sanction to it, but it was a normal state of affairs among mankind. But the fact of business is that United States and Great Britain did the most to end that abusive and ugly institution.
Rod is calling in from Port St. Joe, Florida. Rod, you're on Book TV with author Walter Williams. Go ahead.
All right. Hey, Professor. I didn't realize he had such a long rap sheet. My goodness, what a public menace. My gosh. Hey, I wanted to point out, you brought up the Constitution and the framers, that the framers' design to secure liberty did not, as James Madison said, did not rely on parchment barriers. It didn't rely on words on paper. I mean, it's great that we have all these rights and privileges, societal and natural rights, put there on paper. It's fantastic. However, their system relied on the separation of powers. Excuse me, probably every school kid, I'm 60. My generation, early on, I learned that, we have three branches of government. We have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. However, what the framers inserted in there, which we don't have today, were senators representing their states. The framers recognized that the only rights that were actually secure were those that had an interest group behind them. The 10th Amendment is a dead letter because the states are not in the Senate. We can thank the 17th Amendment for that 102 years ago. My point is that we cannot return, possibly, to freedom in this country until power is once again dispersed widely. And that means among the 50 states and the people there that created this union. Look at today.
Do you know what, Rod? We're going to leave it there and get a response from Walter Williams.
Well, I think that the caller is suggesting, and I think he's absolutely right, but the loss of power by the states because of the senators up for they're not obligated, they're not chosen by the legislatures of the various states, so the states have lost considerable power, and the 10th Amendment means very little. But I think that also the 10th Amendment means very little because of the war between the states. Some people call it the Civil War. I think it's incorrect to call it a Civil War. A Civil War suggests that there are two or more factions fighting to take over the central government, and Jefferson Davis no more wanted to take over Washington, D.C. than George Washington wanted to take over London. So it was really a war between the states. But what the war between the states settled, it settled the issue of secession. And once the issue of secession was settled by brute force, well, then the federal government can do anything it wants to the states. It can just run roughshod over the power of the state. It's very much like if you told my wife that she could not divorce me, I could treat her any way I want to. The very fact of exit is a very, very powerful inducement for people to live up to their contractual agreements. So. And then again, there's the issue that people say, well, what can we do to restore economic freedom or to get us back on the track? And I say, well, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but are we as Americans, as human beings, any different from the people from the Romans, from the French, from the Portuguese, from the Spanish, from the British? These are great empires of the past that went down the tubes for doing many things that we're doing. Are Americans to expect any different from ourselves? I mean, are we any different as human beings? And I think not. So, and then I think we also have to recognize that personal liberty is rare in human existence. That is personal. The liberties that we know in the Western world and in the United States are relatively rare in human existence. And so, I'm all too afraid that a historian writing 200 years from now, he'll say, well, you know, there was this little historical curiosity where people were free, mostly in the West and in the United States. They had some liberty, but it all went back to a normal state of affairs, arbitrary abuse and control by others. I'm all too afraid that that's going to be a trend. And if you ask the question, which way are we Americans headed? Tiny steps at a time. Are we headed towards more personal liberty, or are we headed towards more government control over our lives? It would have to unambiguously be the latter. And so I don't see a trend in the other direction, that is headed towards more liberty and less government control over our lives. So the ultimate end to this process is totalitarianism.
Our live conversation and your calls with Walter Williams will continue after this quick look at some of the authors that he's reading right now and some of his favorite books.
Many of this year's presidential candidates have written books to introduce themselves to voters and to promote their views on issues. Here's a look at some of the candidates' books. In his newest book, Reply All, Jeb Bush catalogs his email correspondence during his time as Florida governor. Presidential candidate and neurosurgeon Ben Carson argues that a better understanding of the Constitution is necessary to solve America's most controversial issues in his latest book, A More Perfect Union. And former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton looks back on her time serving in the Obama administration in Hard Choices. In A Time for Truth, Texas Senator Ted Cruz recounts his journey from a Cuban immigrant's son to the U.S. Senate. Carly Fiorina, former CEO of Hewlett-Packard, is another declared candidate for president. In Rising to the Challenge, she shares lessons that she's learned from her difficulties and triumphs. South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham released an e-book on his website. In My Story, he details his childhood and career in the Air Force. Former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee gives his take on politics and culture in God, Guns, Grits, and Gravy. And in American Will, Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal uses 14 events from our nation's past to explore his vision for the future. Ohio Governor John Kasich calls for a return to what he sees as traditional American values in Stand for Something. More presidential hopefuls with books include Democratic candidate and Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Lessig. In The USA is Lesterland, he argues for campaign finance reform. George Pataki is also running for president. In 1998, the former New York governor released Pataki, where he looked back on his path to the governorship. And Kentucky Senator Rand Paul calls for smaller government and more bipartisanship in his latest book, Taking a Stand. Another entrant into the 2016 presidential race is Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio. In American Dreams, he outlines his plan to advance economic opportunity. Independent Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders is a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president. His 1997 autobiography, now titled Outsider in the White House, was updated to include his time in the Senate and the launch of his presidential campaign. And in blue-collar conservatives, presidential candidate Rick Santorum argues the Republican Party must focus on the working class in order to retake the White House. Donald Trump has written several bestsellers. In his newest book, Crippled America, he outlines his political platform. And finally, Governor Chris Christie and former governors Martin O'Malley and Jim Gilmore have announced their candidacies but have not released books. Book TV has covered many of these candidates. You can watch them on our website, booktv.org.
Walter Williams, as we ask all our authors, some of their favorite books, some of their favorite authors, some of their influences over the life. This is the first time this response has ever come in to us. When asked about his inspirations, this is the producer Nick Raval writing this to me. Williams responded with, all those people involved in my life who didn't give a damn about my self-esteem.
That is absolutely right. They held me accountable to either their own standards or held me accountable to other people's, to high standards in general. And so, for example, at UCLA, that's where I went to graduate school, one has to, in order to get a PhD, one has to take a theory exam and 3 other areas. And when I took the theory exam, 16 students took it and 14 flunked. And I was among the ones that flunked. And they have, it was about 2 professors sit down with you after the exam, and they decide whether to kick you out of the program. One of my professors told me, he says, Walter, your exam was among the worst, but we think you can do much, much better. And so they gave me reading assignments. I had to come to their office and discuss the journal articles. And sometimes I come to the office and they say, Williams, you just said such and such. That's nonsense. Come again read it again and come again next week. And maybe next week or next time I came, I felt very, very good. They say, oh, perfect. And then when I took the exam again, I passed it. And so they didn't give a damn about the legacy of slavery or discrimination or my hard my hard life, but they held me accountable to standards that they held every other student, and that is respectful. That is, if they say, well, look, Williams, there's slavery, there's discrimination, blah 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 blah. We're not going to have you live up to the standards of white people. We're going to have a special standard for you, one that's lower. That would have been insulting, and that would not have helped me in the long run. I'm a better economist as a result of their holding me to the standards they held to other students.
And your PhD is from UCLA as well?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Walter Williams is our guest. We have about an hour and 15 minutes left with him in this month's in-depth program. We're going to put the numbers up on the screen, divided by where you live in the country, East Central time zones and Mountain and Pacific time zones. We've also got several methods of social media where you can contact and make a comment to Walter Williams. We'll flash through those as well. It's an email, it's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's text messages as well. And if you do send a text message, please include your first name and the city that you, city and state, just so we can identify you through that. But this is a tweet that you have received, Dr. Williams. and it's from Chris Heller. I'm sorry, this is a Facebook comment. And Chris Heller wants to know, can you talk about your experience with Milton Friedman?
Milton Friedman, he was a free market economist, a Nobel laureate, I believe, in 1976. He's done outstanding work in economics, and a lot of his work had to do with consumption function. A lot of it had to do with monetary policy. And Milton Friedman, he was one of my mentors at UCLA. He was a visiting professor there, and I took his class. Actually, I audited his class. I was afraid to take it for credit, so I just audited the class. And then after I got my doctorate, we engaged in several activities. One was to write a spending limitation amendment to the United States Congress, spending limitation. And we wrote the amendment, and it was carried in the Senate. It passed in the Senate, I believe, in 1982, and it did not make it through the House. And we offered again in 1986, and it didn't even pass the Senate. But what it sought to do is put a limit on federal spending. And Milton Friedman, he's even if you disagree with him, you have to like him as a person, because he's everybody's old uncle. And I remember one time he called me up. It was like in maybe 1978, and I was in a debate on educational vouchers, school vouchers, and it was at Harvard University, and it was shown on WGB. Is W God Bless Harvard, that WBGH, something like that. Anyway, Milton Friedman called me up next day, and he said, "Walter Williams, your points were right on the money. You brought out the important points, but you made one fatal error." He said, "You didn't smile." He says, "When you talk about liberty, you have to smile." And so I think I've learned that lesson from him, to try as much as I can to smile when I talk about liberty.
Well, from our text message field, Vince Pattison in Texas wants to know what you think of the true flat tax proposal by Dr. Ben Carson.
Well, I think I think that we need to do something in the way of a flat tax. Get rid of some of the loopholes in the current tax system. But I would never support a flat tax unless we got rid of the income tax, because if we did have a flat tax, we would find that we'd have both two types of tax, income tax and a flat tax. And I think that Dick Armey, some years ago, he suggested a 17% flat tax with only exemptions for dependents. And I think that would do away with a lot of the hanky-panky that we see in Washington, because if you look at the two most powerful committees of Congress, there are the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. And these are where lobbyists go to get congressmen to rig the tax law in their favor. And so if we did have a flat tax, we would get rid of much of the Congress's ability to play favorites with different Americans, to write tax loopholes for this American that won't be given to some other American.
Donald Trump says he wants to bring jobs back to America.
Well, the way that you bring jobs back to America is to get government out of the way. Yeah, just getting rid of a lot of the regulations, a lot of the taxes, and I think we would see an upsurge in the number of jobs. Keep in mind that we became the wealthiest nation on the face of the earth long before we had all these regulatory programs. For example, from 1787 until the 1920s, the federal government was only 3% of the GDP, except during wartime. 3% of the GDP, compared to the federal government being 25% of the GDP now. And so you say, how in the world did we go from a third world backward country in 1787 to the richest country and the most powerful country on the face of the earth without all these government programs. I think the reason that we did become a rich country was because we did not have all these government programs. And you ask the question, you know, people say, oh, well, you need housing and urban development. You know, we need a HUD agency. Well, the American people built some of the greatest cities on the face of the earth before HUD was established, I think back in the late 50s. And then it was only after HUD when we found a lot of our cities going down the tubes. And so we always have to ask that question, what did we do before? And people say, oh, well, you need a Department of Education. And it turns out, well, American education was on a higher plane before the Department of Education than afterwards. And so we find all these different programs, all these excuses for the increase in the role of government in our lives without asking the question, what did we do before?
Michael, Oakland, California, thanks for holding. You are on with Walter Williams on Book TV. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Williams, I want to know, what do you think about immigration, illegal immigration specifically, especially economically? And that's my question. I'll take it off the air.
Well, I think that nobody has the right to come into our country except legally. I welcome people to our country. We have a huge country. We have plenty of resources. And matter of fact, that's been our history of people coming to our country legally. But I don't think that people should have a right to ignore our laws to make their first step across our border to be an illegal one. And I think that we should do something to ensure to protect our border. Now, what we should do about the people who are here illegally, that's a little more difficult question, but I think it's clearly an easy answer is that the first thing we ought to do is to secure our borders and make sure that the people that we want in our country are here legally. And then also there's a security issue. That is, the terrorist organizations, if they want to put dirty bombs, if they want to put bacteriological agents in our country, they just have to send the agents through Mexico and come in through Texas, Arizona, or New Mexico, and open up sleeper cells in our country. And so I think that there's a national security issue here as well.
Another text for you, Dr. Williams. Hello, Walter. My name is Devin, and I'm a 25-year-old half-black and half-white male from Virginia. I was just wondering what your opinion is on the new political correctness movement and the sudden cry of cultural appropriation from self-proclaimed allies of minorities.
Well, I think we should ignore the so-called politically correct strictures. When people say to me, well, Williams, you can't say that. Oh, I say, well, damn if I can, because the First Amendment of the United States Constitution guarantees me the right. And so I think that what we ought to do is ignore these people that are demanding that we change our language to accommodate some particular values that they might have.
Front page of the New York Times recently was this article about Halloween. Costume correctness on campus. Feel free to be you, but not me. And it's an article about what is acceptable. And Pocahontas, Caitlyn Jenner, and Pancho Villa are no-nos. Also off limits are geisha girls and samurai warriors. But you can be a Crayola crayon, a cup of Starbucks, or Where's Waldo?
I think that's really going very far. I think our grandparents would be shocked by the kind of things that we accept as that we just accept today. I think we should ignore it.
Do you see political correctness at George Mason?
Probably so, but I ignore it there as well. I don't see it in any of my classrooms, and I'm not politically correct at all. I say whatever I want to say, and my colleagues tolerate me. I've been there. I think I started my 35th year there.
What do you think of tenure? And I presume you're tenured.
Yeah, I'm tenured.
Is tenure an important thing for universities?
No, I think that that we ought to eliminate tenure. That is, you don't have tenure, and the average person does not have tenure. And there's schools like there are universities such as Hillsdale College and Grove City University,
where you used to teach.
Yeah, where I used to teach. And matter of fact, I'm still on the board of trustees, emeritus though. And we don't have tenure, and the school's getting along well. What tenure does not allow you to keep your high-quality professors. What tenure does do, it makes it difficult for you to get rid of your rotten teachers because they have tenure. And I think the same thing happens in public education. That is, teachers who have tenure, it makes it difficult or very, very costly to get rid of them. But it doesn't allow you to keep the good people because if people are competing for them.
Next call for Walter Williams comes from Lori in Pueblo, Colorado. Lori, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Yes, I heard him, the professor, equating the Irish coming here during the potato famine to the black experience, and I almost fell off my chair. There is no comparison to what the blacks suffered and the Irish suffered, Professor. I don't know. History.
But I did not say that. I said.
Well, you said they had it fine and dandy when they came here. You know, they came here with the under terrible conditions, and look how good they did. Yeah, they had a flying start compared to what the blacks have. But my other comment, real quick, and then you can answer.
Lori, hang on. We'll leave you on the line.
You misinterpreted me. I said when people say you have to have food stamps, I said, well, what did the poor Irish do fleeing the potato famine? There was no food stamp program. That's the point I was making. Okay,
well,
but
you know, I'm going to move on. You said that if you elected black mayors, black police chiefs, you kind of said that, look, in these cities where they've elected blacks, the crime is still high or whatever. But I'm going to say to you, in the places where there are black leaders, that doesn't mean that the people underneath them are not racist, mean people. If you got a black police chief, there's still going to be racist police officers. I live in a town where you can count the black people on your one hand. And when I called in and my car had been broken in, the first thing out of that police officer's mouth is, oh, I bet it's a black person. I'm like, what? There aren't even any around here, but they're ready to blame them for everything. So, yeah, you can comment off the air, but I know I heard you correctly on the Irish thing, because everybody in the room was just looking at like, wow.
Lori, before we let you go, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Nope, we will never know. She hung up. Walter Williams.
Well, I don't know what to say. Let's move on.
David, Chicago, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Professor Williams, it's a great honor and a pleasure to speak with you today. My question is, early in the program, you remarked that you don't see existing inequalities of wealth and income as necessarily problematic. But as libertarians, we also acknowledge that there are several layers of distortions and interventions in the economic system that separate it from being a true free market. So I wondered if you think that existing interventions might be aggravating problems of wealth and inequality, wealth and income inequality.
I think that your quote is incorrect, but however, I've argued, and you can look in my books, particularly Race and Economics, I point out that very often the economic game is rigged. It's rigged against people who can be described as latecomers and outsiders. And one example I give is the taxi cab industry. That is, what does it take for a person to be able to get into business, become an owner-operator of a taxi? Well, and maybe make $50,000 a year. Well, it doesn't take a whole lot of capital. You get a used car, and you get some insurance, and you learn the city streets. But it turns out, in New York City, for example, the license to own and operate one taxi costs $700,000. That was as of last year. And in Boston, $400,000. In Chicago, $300,000. Miami, around $400,000 or $500,000. So what is the effect of these licensing regulations? Well, they tend to keep people out of the taxi cab business who don't have $700,000 lying around, or who don't have bank credit to get. And so that discriminates against outsiders, and the game is rigged because insiders want to keep the outsiders out so they can get a higher wage. Another law that discriminates against people moving up to the mainstream American society is the minimum wage law. And so a lot of Americans, matter of fact, most Americans support the minimum wage law, and they support it out of the intentions, because it has very good intentions. But when you look at a law, we shouldn't ask what are the intentions, we should ask what are the effects of such a law. And you see the effects of a minimum wage, let's say, of $7 an hour, if you say, well, look, put yourself in the place of an employer, and you must pay $7 an hour to no matter whom you hire. Actually, it costs you more than that because they're mandated fringes, but for sake of argument, let's stick with $7. If you must pay $7 an hour to no matter whom you hire, will you hire that worker who is so unfortunate so as to have skills which will only enable him to produce $4 worth of value per hour? Most employers would see that as a losing economic proposition. That is, pay somebody $7 an hour when that somebody can only produce $4 worth of value. So the minimum wage discriminates against the employment of low-skilled workers. And who are the low-skilled workers in our society? Well, for the most part, they're teenagers. And their teenagers have low skill because they lack the maturity and the experience and other attributes of adults. Among the teenagers are black teenagers who not only share the handicaps of teenagers in general, but they share the additional handicaps of living in rotten neighborhoods, going to rotten schools. So what the minimum wage law does, it cuts off the bottom rungs of the economic ladder, because if you could pay a person $4 an hour, at least he'll be working and gaining some experience, and later on be ultimately worth $7, $8, $9 an hour. But the minimum wage cuts off the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. I've written about the Davis-Bacon Act, which is a super minimum wage law that restricts employment for blacks, and restricts that discriminates against non-union labor. And if you read the Davis-Bacon Act is still in the books today, and if you read the congressional testimony in support of the Davis-Bacon Act, and matter of fact, if you go to March 31st, page 6513 of the congressional record, you'll see all the statements from politicians saying, see that contractor over there? He brings cheap colored labor up from the South, and he puts them in cabins, and it's labor of that sort that is competing with white Americans. In my book, In South Africa's War Against Capitalism, racist unions in South Africa were the major supporters of minimum wage laws for blacks. And their stated reason was to protect white workers from having to compete with low-skilled, low-wage black workers. Well, in the United States, we don't use the same rhetoric, but the effect is the same. That is, to discriminate against the employment of the least preferred worker. And so there are many regulations on the books that create disadvantages for disadvantaged people, but we don't focus on that. We focus on discrimination. We focus on this and focus on that, rather than looking at the rules of the game and the various regulations that discriminate against the less preferred individual.
Walter Williams, I want to show something from your website. It's a certificate, and have you explain what exactly we're looking at. A proclamation of amnesty and pardon granted to all persons of European descent.
Well, I wrote that when I was teaching at Temple University. I was teaching at Temple University in Philadelphia from 1973 until 1980 when I went to George Mason. Then I went to George Mason University. And when I became a faculty member at Temple University, there was a push for black economics, a class in black economics. And so I was asking my colleagues, how do demand curves and supply curves slope for black people compared to white people? What is the basic economic difference? And they couldn't come up with any answers. And I said that that you're doing these things because you feel a sense of guilt. And so as a matter of fact, during a department meeting, what I told my colleagues when they brought this up, I said, what I'd like to do is to forgive you for both your own grievances and those of your forebears against my people, so that you stop feeling guilty and stop acting like damn fools. I said, now, if some Italian students came to your office demanding Italian economics, you would throw them out of, or Chinese students demanding Chinese economics, you would throw them out of your office. But for black students, you would, you listen to the argument. So I think a lot of what we see is motivated by white guilt. And I think that guilt is perhaps one of the most dangerous and despicable motivations for doing anything.
Here was an article that appeared when you were teaching at Temple in the Philadelphia Inquirer. It's in your book, Up from the Projects. Racism, ? Temple professor opposes easy grades for blacks. And on the jump, you can see professor opposes leniency for blacks.
Well, I came across this, when I was at Temple University, a very nice professor. He asked me to go to lunch with him. And he said, during the lunch, he was saying some of the problems that he's having with his black students. He said, they don't come every day. Sometimes they don't hand in their assignments. Many times they're sleeping in class, or they hand in their assignments done not very well. And so I said, well, what do you do? He was asking me what do I recommend. I said, what do you do? And so he says, well, I try to take in consideration the poverty and discrimination. I said, no, you have an electrographic pencil just like I do, and you have to put down a grade. And so he says, well, if they come every day and they look like they're taking notes, I'll give them a C. And I said, do you know what you're doing? I said, that's like my having a dog in an English class, and sometime during the semester, a dog gets on his hind legs and says, you're not supposed to do that. Well, you give the damn dog an A, because you don't expect the dog to say anything, and whatever he says is laudable. I said, you're insulting and you're hurting these students by such a policy. So, as a matter of fact, I found out that a number of my colleagues were doing the same thing. And they're motivated by guilt or trying to compensate for the legacy of slavery or discrimination and poverty. And I don't think that does a person very much good in the long run.
Steve in Arlington Heights, Illinois, texts into you. Can you speak to the anti-Confederate hysteria currently sweeping the nation?
Yes, I think that I think people don't really understand much of the history of our country. And just very briefly, and this is on my website and my articles, and I talk about this, and that is in 1783, there was a Treaty of Paris. And the Treaty of Paris ended the war between the colonies in Great Britain. And if you read the Treaty of Paris, it says that there are 13 sovereign nations. That is, each state was a nation. And these states came together as principals in 1787, and they created the federal government as their agent. And principals can always fire their agents. And so, and if you read the ratification documents of Rhode Island, New York, and Virginia, they specifically say in the documents that if the federal government becomes abusive of the powers that we have delegated to the federal government, we have the right to rescind those powers. That is, we have the right to secede. And so So most Americans do not understand the, they think that the war was solely to end slavery, but the war was for much more than that. And so, but however, the winners of any war write its history. And so the Confederacy has just, they've gotten really a bad name. And I think that I think that this anti-Confederacy movement is just maybe one more step towards towards abolishing many of our symbols. Now, one can argue whether the Confederacy was right in seceding, and you don't have to be for slavery. You can be against slavery, but that's an independent argument. Did they have the right to secede? And all the evidence suggests, yes, they did have the right to secede because the states were principals and they came together and created the federal government. That is, most Americans today they virtually think that the states are a creation of the federal government. As a matter of fact, that's the way Congress acts, that the states are a creation of the federal government, but it's actually the opposite.
Trey in Fresno, California, thanks for holding. You're on the air with Walter Williams.
Thank you, C-SPAN, for what you're doing. It's beautiful. Brother Williams, I wanted to ask a question of economics to you. Are you aware of any societies, any economies throughout history that didn't have scarcity as a foundation, as its base in the economy?
Say that again. Repeat that.
Are you aware of any economies throughout history that didn't have scarcity as its foundation or its base?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, the economic theory would not exist unless there was scarcity. And what scarcity simply means is that human wants exceed the means to satisfy those wants, and that gives rise to, and scarcity gives rise to conflict, and we have to somehow find ways to resolve the conflict, and we can resolve conflict through the market mechanism, through government, through violence, and through gifts. And so, yes, scarcity. Without scarcity, there would not be any economic problems whatsoever.
John in Portland, Oregon, in a text message, in what ways do you believe black Americans would be better off if no welfare state had ever been instituted?
Well, I think that not only black Americans, but Americans in general, I think that Americans in general they'd be more independent. That is, see, I think one of the things we have to recognize, and any economist, I believe, whether he's liberal or conservative or free market, he will tell you that if you tax something, you're going to get less of it. And if you subsidize something, you're going to get more of it. And what we've been doing is subsidizing slovenly behavior. I mean, you see like the duration of unemployment has, I think, almost doubled since the 1940s. And one of the reasons why the duration of unemployment has doubled is because of unemployment compensation, whereby people can pick and choose. They can say, oh, I'm not going to take this hamburger flipper job. I'm going to wait for something better to come along. But if not accepting that job meant starvation, then they would not make such a decision. I think that that it creates a dependence mentality. To give you an example of this, my wife has a huge family, as I suggested that she was the youngest of 10 children. And she has a huge family. And one time we were over their house, and two of her nieces were arguing about money. And one said, "I'll pay you. I'll give you damn money when I get paid." And she was referring to going to the mailbox picking up a welfare check. I mean, the idea that a welfare check is payment. Now, it's not only poor people; it's farmers. Farmers think that they have a right to get subsidies. Sugar producers, they think they have the right to get subsidies. Businesses think that they have the right to get subsidies. Walt Disney, they think that you and I should subsidize their advertisements and or subsidize their campaigns. That is, we become a nation of thieves. That is what we become, a nation of people seeking to live at the expense of other people. And I think that represents a moral decay.
Bill in Rock, Michigan. Good afternoon to you, Bill. Bill, Rock, Michigan. Let's try John in Kearney, Missouri. John, you're on Book TV with Walter Williams. Hello.
Yeah, I just have let me make this illustrious Dr. Williams. I'll make this as a statement. I just want your opinion. I think you're always hearing about microaggression. This seems to me to be a cry by people who make their living on racism to make sure there's something around if the real racism goes away. And that's really, I just like your opinion on that. Thank you very much, and you look great, by the way.
Thank you. Now, my take on microaggression is very similar to my colleague Tom Sowell. He wrote a column. He calls it micro-totalitarianism, and that's what it is. That is, people try to stop people from expressing certain views, and that's nothing more than totalitarianism.
Text message. Should some form of public service be required for full citizenship rights?
No, I don't think so. I think that a lot of people say, well, should you be in the Army, or should you work on roads to be a citizen? I say, no, that's nonsense. I don't think that public service should be a right. Should be a requirement for citizenship.
Anna, Auburn, Alabama. Text. Professor, do you think the Fed serves a viable purpose in our economy?
I think the Fed has been very unproductive. I think you can just do, the justification for the Federal Reserve Bank, Federal Reserve Act, was to promote price stability and end bank failures. And if you do just a simple before and after analysis, you'll find that price stability was greater before the Federal Reserve Act, and there are fewer bank failures before the Federal Reserve Act than after the Federal Reserve Act. And I think that the Federal Reserve Bank, and this might not be nice for me to say it this way, but they enable the government to steal from its citizens by inflating the currency. And I've often suggested to people that if they ever find themselves on trial for counterfeiting, they should just tell the judge that they were engaging in monetary policy. That's what the Federal Reserve does.
Walter Williams, your publisher is the Hoover Institution Press.
Yes.
Why do you go with the Hoover Institution Press and not perhaps a major New York publisher?
Well, they've made life easy for me. That's one. And
I'm not denigrating them in any way.
No.
Do we?
Well, so it's kind of maybe some inertia. Although I've been criticized for using them all the time because some people say that they don't spend enough resources in publicizing the book. But for the American Contempt for Liberty, they spend considerable resources in publicizing the book.
So if someone said, "Okay, I want to pick up a Walter Williams book," do they go for the newest book, American Contempt? Sorry about that noise if you hear that. Or do they go for Up from the Projects, where one book?
Well, I would say American Contempt for Liberty. And the reason why is that it's a collection of my columns, and there's a collection of my ideas in a whole range of topics. Books like South Africa's War Against Capitalism are a little bit more narrowly focused, and as well as the Race and Economics, that's a little more narrowly focused. But I think Race and Economics, I would recommend that as the second choice.
Joan, Bryan, Texas. Joan, you're on Book TV on C-SPAN 2. This is In Depth. Walter Williams is our guest.
Okay, thank you. Walter Williams, this is sort of a personal economic problem. I'm in my 80s and have gone through the Depression and World War II and have grown up in a very frugal way of managing my finances. And right now I do have some money saved. However, in the bank, I'm getting less 1% interest is a big deal. Personally, where should we old people put our money because we're afraid to take too many risks? And in a way, with the Social Security not being increased because there supposedly is no inflation, I kind of feel that my age group has had it. What's your opinion as to where we old people should invest? Thank you. I'll listen.
Well, I'm not a financial advisor, but there are many places like there are mutual funds that maintain a portfolio in equities and bonds that you can check out. What you need to do is talk to an investment counselor. Call up a UBS or Merrill Lynch or some other investment house and ask for a stockbroker to give you some ideas, and he'll be very happy to give you some ideas because he'd like to have your account. So, but I'm not going to. When people ask me, Williams, what's going to happen to interest rates? What's going to happen to stocks? I tell them if I knew the answer to that, I would not be sitting here talking to Peter. I would be out on my yacht, and I'd be rich, and I'm not rich, so I don't have the answers.
Walter Williams, when you were a teenager, you bought shares in Pepsi-Cola.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Well, yeah, I used to work after school for the stock broker, and I used to sweep the floor, and I'd deliver packages. And one day we were sitting talking, there was nothing going on. He says, I can sell your people, and at that time your people was not a derogatory term, I can sell your people a shiny vacuum cleaner, and I couldn't sell them a share of stock. And so I just listened to him. And so next time we talk, I say, what stock? And so he says, well, he was explaining to me what stock is. And so maybe a couple times later, I said, suppose I want to buy stock. He said, well, you choose something that you like. And so he gave me a list of stocks. And so I saw Pepsi-Cola. I loved Pepsi-Cola as a kid. And so the man went out and bought me one share of Pepsi-Cola, and I think that it could have been around $12 or $13 a share. And subsequently, when I got more, and it really cost him to buy, he had to pay some kind of fee to get one share. And so I started accumulating shares of Pepsi-Cola, and then I stopped buying it because it got too expensive. And so what it did, it forced me into looking at the newspaper and following my Pepsi-Cola share, and I look for other stocks around it, and I read some of the newspaper accounts on what was going in the stock market. So I learned a little bit about it. But I've been on the stock market, I guess 14 or 15 years old, and I've been ever since. And the point I make is that if I did not have that job, I would not have met that guy. And if, in other words, if there were a minimum wage law, there would be many, that not only that opportunity, but other opportunities that would have been denied from me, and I might have not turned out the same way.
What happened to you in the Korean War era when you declared yourself white?
Well, I had a whole lot of problems when I was in the Army. I was drafted in the Army. Sometimes I don't call it a draft. My labor services were confiscated by the United States government. This is 1959. And I was sent to Fort Stewart, Georgia, and without a very good orientation on the Southern way of life. And so I had some adjustment problems. And the adjustment problems led to my being court-martialed. And I won the court-martial. I made a jackass out of the people who court-martialed me. And I brought charges against this company commander who court-martialed me, and the charge was undue hardship on a person subject to your command. But before I could get the court-martial charges started, I was sent to Korea. And when I landed in Korea, you had to fill out these forms to give your race, your next notification of next of kin, and things like this. And where it said race, I put down Caucasian. And the chief warrant officer who was inspecting the forms, he would say, soldier, you made the mistake. And so I said, I didn't make a mistake. And so he said, you put down Caucasian? I said, yeah, I'm Caucasian. And so we went around and around. He said, why would we put down Caucasian? I said, look, if I put down Negro, I get the worst job over here. I never changed the marking that I put down there, the checkoff that I put down for Caucasian, and he probably changed it. But I was a troublemaker when I was in the Army, a first-class troublemaker.
Something about painting a truck?
Yeah, well, I was sent to the motor pool and to work with trucks. And that was, they gave blacks some menial jobs there. And so this officer told me to paint a truck. You paint the flatbed of the truck. And so I said, the whole truck? And so he said, yeah, the whole truck. And so I started painting the tires, I painted the windows, and guys are crowding around me and laughing. And so not the company commander, but this officer came up and said, what was I doing? And so I said, I'm painting the whole truck. So he made me wash the paint off by solvent. And then I got another job washing trucks, and I put the hose inside the engine to wash the engine out. Because I told the guy there was a lot of grease and dirt in there. And then they kicked me out of the motor pool, and I was sent up to the lunchroom, the dining hall, to be the mop man. And I was kicked out of that job because the head chef caught me mopping off the meat table with the floor mop, and it was a horrendous sight. You know, the nasty water flowing over the sides. So long story short, I was sent to the battalion headquarters to sweep up every day. And so it turned out that this corporal, he was getting discharged, and I asked the sergeant major, could I have his job? And so they laughed and they said, you couldn't do it. And so I said, well, give me a chance. And so I typed out, he gave me something to type out, and I made some corrections, and he decided to give me a chance, and I became the head clerk of the battalion. And I did some things as head clerk because I was in the field of communication, and I was the only black there in the field of communication. And they used to have separate dances on posts, dance for the white guys and dance for the black guys. So so they would send a sergeant and some soldiers to town to get the girls to come out to the base. And so one time the sergeant called. He called up and said, can I speak to the sergeant major? And I said, Sergeant Major's not here, but can I take a message? He said, yeah, tell the sergeant major that I've plenty of nigger bus drivers, but no nigger NCOs. And so I said, yes, sir. And when the sergeant major came in, it turned out that the inspector general was from Washington, was doing an inspection of the post, and they had generals and colonels. And so I went over to the water fountain, and I hollered over to the sergeant major with the message. And so one of the colonels said, "Get that SOB up here," and they dressed him. They got him up there, and they raised hell with him, you know. So I did all kinds. I was a bit of a troublemaker, quite a bit of a troublemaker.
This email for you from Thad in Charlotte, North Carolina. Please comment on the tendency of liberal blacks to treat blacks with conservative views as less black. Has this affected your career?
Well, it hasn't affected my career because I ignore them. And but however, I think that for people to suggest that there should be a monopoly on ideas that black people have about many of the important issues, I think that is counterproductive. I think black people cannot afford to have a monopoly on the various ideas, and many of the various ideas that have been put out in terms of helping blacks have been disastrous. And so I think what we need to have is we need to have other ideas. I don't think anybody should have a monopoly on any idea, whether it's about black people, whether it's about food and drugs or health or whatever. I think that a superior outcome is always the result of a competition in the marketplace of ideas.
Mark in Columbia, South Carolina. Please go ahead with your question or comment for Walter Williams.
Thank you. And thank you for your service. But my question has to do with the legacy of tobacco in America and your view on today's situation with the, with tobacco products.
What about it? I think that
it's something you write about quite a bit.
Yes, I have. I think that the idea that we should outlaw, let's say, cigarettes and cigarette smoking, I think that it's a violation of property rights, and I mean in the following sense: the issue is not whether tobacco smoke is harmful to others or not. The issue is private property rights. That is, for example, if you own a restaurant and you do not want people smoking, then it's your right to put a sign outside saying, "No smoking in my restaurant." And if I own a restaurant and I want to permit people to smoke, I put a sign outside saying that smoking is permitted. So people have the option. They know whether smoking is there or is permitted or not. And if they don't want to come in under those conditions, they don't come in. The same thing with the idea of you're not wanting smoking in a restaurant. Well, then people go to your restaurant and they say, "Oh, this guy does not allow smoking, so I'm not going to go in his restaurant." Now, see, most Americans will support the idea that the government ought to come in and tell a restaurant owner that he cannot permit smoking in his restaurant. But suppose, on the other hand, there was a majority who said that, well, since you don't want smoking in your restaurant, we're going to force you to permit smoking. That is, we're going to use the political mechanism to require that you permit smoking in your restaurant. You would view that as totalitarianism. Well, it's the same way the other way around. Now, another side effect of it is that what Americans have done, they've invited government into our lives, because totalitarians, I don't know any totalitarian who is awakened one morning and said, "I'm tired of tyrannizing people. I'm going to rest now." Well, what totalitarians do, they find that, well, gee, if we can control smoking, well, we can control the amount of soda that you drink, such as the mayor in New York. Or we can control whether you have foie gras in your restaurant, or whether, or how many, whether there can be salt in your diet. And so once you tell a person, you tell government that they can control certain areas of your life, well, they have incentive to try everything else to control your life. And so we've invited people to control our lives. And I think that smoking represented the beginning of it. And it's kind of interesting how these people start. They always start out small. You know, at the beginning of the anti-smoking movement, they say, "Oh, we just want warning signs on cigarettes." Then they got the warning signs on cigarettes. Then we say, "Well, we want no smoking sections in airplanes." They got the no smoking section. Then they say, "Oh, we don't want any smoking whatsoever." Then they got that. "Well, we don't want any smoking in the airport." And then they got that. "Well, we don't want smoking within 50 feet of the doors of the airport." And so it always starts out small, and then it gets larger and larger. That's almost with any act of government.
In More Liberty Means Less Government, you write, "I'm at a loss for what can be done to gender norm boxing. The fact of business is that we humans are not equal."
Well, that is right. We're not equal. Now, a lot of people want to pretend that we're equal because they think that equality before the law requires that you be, in fact, equal. But we're not equal. There's no evidence to suggest that we're equal by race or by sex. If you look at, for example, how in the world would you explain that Jews are 3% of the American population, but they win 40% of the Nobel Prizes won by Americans? How do you explain that? or blacks are 13% of the population, and 80% of the NBA basketball players, and their highest paid ones, or 66% of the NFL football players, and or there are virtually no blacks in Olympic class swimmers, or all with the 100-yard dash, 100-meter dash, they're almost all won by blacks. And so we can't pretend there are differences between people. Even medically, that is, there's Sephardic Jews, they get Tay-Sachs disease to a greater extent than everybody else. The Pima Indians have the world's highest known rates of diabetes. Blacks have sickle cell anemia, where other populations it's not significant at all. So we are different, and men are stronger than women. Men have a greater upper body strength than women. Men have testosterone, which means that on almost every measure of hostility, aggression, and competition, men score a standard deviation higher than women. So we're different, and so now because we're different, shouldn't mean that we should be treated differently in the eyes of the law. And so I think that I say vive la difference.
Al, Ames, Iowa. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Hi.
My comment is earlier talking about Irish, and when they came to America, something that's very rarely talked about is the fact that how the British so despised the Irish hundreds of years before that, and captured and enslaved Irishmen and sent them to different places to work. And also during the potato famine, I know as a college student taking these history courses, learning about this, that the Irish actually had enough food during the time of the potato famine, when the potato blight took place, that they could have not had to starve to death, and that millions of them would not have had to have fled Ireland for places like the United States so they could have food to live off of. But the British, however, placed many military people, many regiments all throughout Ireland to make sure that the food was shipped out of Ireland, and the Irish had to just subsist on basically potatoes, which had the blight. We also very rarely hear about the fact that black people were captured by blacks in Africa and then sold by those blacks to the slave traders. We don't hear about a lot about slavery, except a certain politically correct kind of slavery issue.
Well, I think that the issue is that there's probably enough a grievance for all ethnic groups for each of us to have our share. I mean, that is, we've lived in a brutal and ugly world where there's been massive aggression and massive denial of basic human rights, and so there's enough for almost every ethnic group or racial group to have their share. I don't know of any particular group of people who have not seen oppression of one form or another. So, yeah, of course. And matter of fact, kind of interesting case about Irish, you need not go back any more than, let's say, 1910 or 1890 to see signs in advertisements that any race except Irish, any race can apply, when they're advertising for jobs, any race except Irish, or restaurants saying that anybody admitted except Irish and dogs. So yeah, Irish face the discrimination, and many groups, or most groups in the United States, face some form of discrimination, whether it was Japanese, Chinese, Irish, Black Americans, Jewish Americans. I don't know of any other group. Maybe the people with English ancestry, maybe they face the lowest amount of discrimination, but there's been discrimination and oppression for all the groups in the United States. Now, of course, different groups responded in different ways, but that can be studied. But nonetheless, various groups face varying degrees of discrimination.
Here is a text message we received. I want to show this on the air, see if you recognize this picture. It was a picture sent to us. Let's see if I can get this. I'm not very good with. There we go. Let's try that, guys, and see if we can get that picture on the air. And is that anybody you recognize? That's your grandson. According to this text message, it said your grandson is enjoying watching the show. Do you see that there? Can you see it now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Hi.
So that was sent in. Rosalind, Baltimore, Maryland. Hello.
Yeah, thank you for answering. Your answer to this question is probably blank, but I was prompted to call based on your remark on totalitarianism. Totalitarianism.
Yes.
What the Constitution is the law, and if you're denied due process to resolve a matter, and in the denial of it for years, the ones who are making for the denial are benefiting off of no due process, which is the law. How does the Constitution speak for me if I am not afforded due process, and it's the law?
Well, I think that the Constitution calls for due process, and do you have a specific area in mind?
Well, it would require an attorney to represent me, but the situation is just that unique. That means that it just could go on and on and on with no due process.
No, I don't understand the question.
Okay. Jim in Colorado texts in, were you ever the beneficiary of affirmative action?
Well, if I was, I don't know about it. As a matter of fact, when I was interviewing for a job at, let's say, at Temple University, I told the department chairman, I asked the department chairman, are you under any pressure to hire a black person in your department? And so he says, no, I'm not under any pressure, but we would like to have you. And I told him, well, I'm going to accept you at your word, but when if I find out that you're not telling me the truth, I'm going to quit the very day that I find out about it. At George Mason, I'm pretty sure they weren't under any pressure to hire a black person. At least in my 35 years there, I haven't found that they were under pressure. And then, moreover, if they're under any pressure to hire a black person, I don't count as the right black person. I mean, they have to hire a liberal black person. So I don't count. Matter of fact, I had a colleague at Temple University. He heard me in the hallway talking not very nicely to one of my colleagues on this guilt stuff, and so he said, and he's a friend of mine. He said, Walter, he says, don't blame anything on racial discrimination in our department. He said, people wouldn't like you even if you were white. So that was an observation made by a good colleague and friend of mine.
Ben in Chester, Virginia wants to know via text message, when I was in college in the late 70s, the monetarist economic theory was taught. What are you teaching today?
Well, I don't teach monetary economics. I teach microeconomic theory. As I said earlier in the show, that I teach our first PhD, our first year PhD students microeconomic theory, and in the spring I teach undergraduate microeconomic theory. So I don't get into monetary theory, and when I did take monetary theory as a class, I did not do very well in it. So I'm not really good into that. I love reading about monetary theory, but I'm not an expert in it at all.
Especially during election season, we often hear politicians talk about how they're going to do this for the economy or that for the economy. Do politicians in Washington have that much control that they can do this or do that for the economy?
Well, you know, I think politicians, they have very, very limited ability to do good for our economy. Very, very limited ability. And they have awesome power to do harm. And so when people would say to me some years ago, when I got a job, I was teaching at Grove City College in 1990s, and so I asked people. I said, "Now I got a job teaching at Grove City College in 1990s during the Clinton administration. Was President Clinton responsible for my getting the job? What did he actually do to make me get a job at Grove City College?" And I doubt whether he even knew that I got a job at Grove City College. So a president or politicians have very, very limited ability to do good and awesome ability to do harm for the economy.
And I can't find the right book, Dr. Williams. Maybe it's in here, but it's... Did I find it? Nope. It's about corporations, spineless corporations, and you take on Citibank for paying reparations.
Yeah, a lot of corporations, they will try to buy off their adversaries. They will do things like contribute to the environmentalist movement, or contribute to the idea of reparations. And I think that I mean, there's, as I suggested a little bit earlier, there's been enough grief that if we're going to pay reparations, everybody ought to receive reparations. But I think that one of the problems is that when people say, "Look, we're going to pay reparations today," so it means that white people of the day have to compensate black people of the day for what white people of yesterday did to black people of yesterday. Now, if you believe in individual accountability, you have to find such a standard offensive, and that is to punish a white of the day to help a black of the day to compensate what a white of yesterday did to a black of yesterday. And when people are talking about reparations, yes, I think that reparations ought to be paid to slaves, because slavery was a great injustice. But that's going to have to be a matter taken care of in heaven. That is, there no way we can compensate slaves for slavery, and so, but for their children who never faced slavery, I think that it does make sense.
Elaine's calling in from Sun City, California. Elaine, we've got about 10 minutes left with our guest, Walter Williams.
Thank you. Will you comment on the effect of the change from an economy based on savings with compounding interest to one of investment in the stock market? And did it take power and accountability away from individuals and ultimately give it to the government? Thank you.
Well, I think that investing in equities, I don't think that in itself gives power to the government. And I think that we still have a society where, you know, if you save, there's a compounding of interest. I think that is not going away.
Daniel, Batesville, Indiana. Hi, Daniel. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. My question for Professor Williams is about the government takeover of the college loan industry and how that's going to affect the total economy in the future. I believe we're now at over $1 trillion, and millennials can't get jobs, so I'll take my answer off here.
What industry did you say the government taking over?
The government loan industry, or the loan industry for college students.
Oh. That
the government has basically taken over?
Well, it hasn't seemed to be, with all the defaults, it hasn't appeared to be a success.
What does it cost a year to go to George Mason? Do you know?
I think the tuition is about $16,000.
Is that a reasonable amount for a college education?
Well, it's much lower than many other colleges.
Affordable?
Yeah, it's much lower. That is, there's some colleges where tuition room and board, you're talking about $55,000, like at Princeton or Harvard or some of these other colleges. And
as an economist, is that affordable? Is it worthwhile?
No, it's not worth it. Matter of fact, I think that roughly 40 to 50% of students who are in college should not be there in the first place. And that is anybody who is admitted to college who is not college ready, as suggested by the requirement that so many kids have to take remedial English and remedial math. They're not ready for college. I think that it's a waste of resources. I think that when sometimes I'll go to the library and I'll see some kids out there playing Frisbee. I go to the library at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I come back at 11 o'clock, and the same kids are out there playing Frisbee. And so I'm wondering whether it's very productive for them. Now, here's what I think that many kids, many young people, when they graduate from high school, their parents should go out and should try to make sure that they get a job at McDonald's or at a car wash, at some of the other places, to gain maturity. And then to go back and maybe when they're in the mid-20s, maybe having gained some maturity, go to college. I know that in my own personal life, if I had gone to college right out of high school, it would have been an unmitigated disaster. And so I started college when I was 25 years old. I was married, and I'd been in the Army, and I worked.
From our Facebook page, this is Craig Wiley. When I was a young black man in Camden, New Jersey, there were some jobs, a shipyard, factories, and major retail outlets, leftovers from the World War II economic boom. The town was systematically eviscerated. A highway was built around the town, the first nail in the coffin. Mr. Williams doesn't know BS and is an apologist for the systematic exclusion of people of African ancestry from economic empowerment by the public and private sectors.
Well, I think that's an unfortunate view of the world. Matter of fact, for that person, I used to work in Camden. I used to, when my cousin and I, we worked for Campbell Soup, unloading tomatoes in April, in August. And I used to shine shoes. I get on the ferry and shine shoes over in Camden. So Camden was a flourishing city at one time. But, you know, a lot of times you have to say, well, what drove the businesses out of the cities? Well, a lot of things like taxes, high crime, poor schools, and although you have to ask the question, what drove the people out of a particular city? And so you see that in many cities, suburbanization of the cities, and a lot of times people are talking about white flight to the suburbs, and it turns, this was in the 70s, a very, very popular topic, but it turns out that black flight to the suburbs is greater than white flight to the suburbs, and it turns out that black people don't like being mugged any more than white people, and so one has to ask the question: what created the condition? Look at Detroit. Detroit at one time during the 40s, 50s, and I believe part of the 60s, it was a city with 1.9 million people. It was a flourishing city. Today, it's around 700,000 people in the city. People have left, and industry has gone, and people have to ask why. And it turns out that Coleman Young was the mayor during the 70s. He was responsible for a lot of the policy. He and his successors were responsible for a lot of policies that ran industry and people out of the city of Detroit. So one has to ask, what led to the evacuation of many of our cities? And people don't want to ask that question at all.
How often do you write your column? Is it once a week, twice a week?
Yeah, once a week. Once a week. That's the best I can do.
And how many newspapers are you in?
About 140. It varies.
Creator
and a whole
Syndicate.
bunch of websites. It's nationally syndicated by Creator Syndicate that I've been with for a number of years.
Robert, Wales, Massachusetts. Please go ahead.
How's the day going? I listened to all this today, and one of the things that really interests me about when our president got elected, and I live in a small white community here in New England, there was no Tea Party until he got elected. And from my own personal observation, from my customers that come and go over the last 7 years, we have a lot of people here in this country that were really surprised that we elected a black president. And I think his problems, since he's been president, has been because he was our first black president. And I'll rest my case.
What kind of business do people come in to see you about?
I have a little convenience store, and we get in some real Donnybrooks about here. And in the past, when customers came in and spoke disparagingly and negative about my president, I just said, I'll put your grocery back, here's your money. And I probably kicked out 500 people in the last 7 years. I just don't put up with some of the dialogue that the people who I know go to church all the time, are as white as can be, and say such negative things about our president. It didn't come out of nowhere. Well, I never heard any comments like that.
That's Robert in Wales, Massachusetts. And if I could take this liberty to read one paragraph from your book, American Contempt for Liberty, just to add on. This is from 2010. Early indications suggest that the Barack Obama presidency might turn out to be similar to the failed presidency of Jimmy Carter. That's bad news for the nation, you write, but especially bad news for black Americans. No white presidential candidate had to live down the disgraced presidency of Carter, but I'm all too fearful that a future black presidential candidate will find himself carrying the heavy baggage of a failed black president. That's not a problem for white liberals who voted for Obama, who received their one-time guilt-relieving dose from voting for a black man to be president, but it is a problem for future generations of black Americans.
Well, one thing I'm wrong in one assessment. I think that a future black president might have to carry the baggage of a failed black president such as Obama. That is, with the support that Ben Carson is getting. It seems like I think that it shows that Americans are good enough not to hold Ben Carson responsible for Barack Obama. But I think that what the caller recognized is that black people did not elect Obama to the presidency. It's just not enough of us. So the way that he got into office was having huge numbers of white people vote for him. And I think that's a statement, that alone is a statement about the goodness of the American people. That is that we were able to eventually get around to electing a black president, or at least a partially black president. But I think that he just has not, I think he squandered that goodness among the American people by his presidency.
Ada, Ardmore, Pennsylvania. You could be the last word, Ada.
How nice. Thank you so much. I'd like to say Walter Williams is a voice of reason on every topic. And I don't use that word reason because it's the magazine of the libertarians. I use it because I do agree with everything he said thus far. And I want to see his smile and those long legs back here in Philadelphia as soon as possible. Could he please let us know how we could get him and his wife to visit us again and speak to us?
Well, Ada, tell us a little bit about yourself before we get an answer from Professor Williams.
You remember me. I'm the 90-year-old that's a libertarian, Caucasian, was married to an Army officer, and the first joke he told me was about the two black men in the motor pool, and they got into an accident, and one of them said to the other, "See, do the horn still blow?" As if that was a necessary thing. So believe me, I know all about what he's talking about with the Army, and I do agree with him, and please tell me how we can get him and his wife to visit us here in Ardmore, PA. Come back to Philly.
Well, thank you very much for your complimentary comments. And unfortunately, I can't get my wife at all because she passed away 7 years ago. And but, you know, I get back to the Philadelphia area now and then. And I think that there's at the Union League Club, I think that there's I'll be giving a talk there. I believe it's December 3rd, but you can check on their site. But at the same time, people can go to my website, which is walterewilliams.com.
walterewilliams.com.
Yeah, walterewilliams.com. And you can see many of the things about me. And sometimes when I have events, upcoming events, I post it on that site. Plus, there are a lot of book recommendations and other things that you can gather from the site.
Walter Williams, A State Against Blacks, came out in 1982. America, A Minority Viewpoint, also that year. All It Takes Is Guts, South Africa's War Against Capitalism. Books, Do the Right Thing, More Liberty Means Less Government, Liberty versus the Tyranny of Socialism, Up from the Projects, his autobiography, Race and Economics, and American Contempt for Liberty is his newest book. He has been our guest for the last 3 hours on Book TV. Thanks for your time.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
C-SPAN, created by America's cable companies 30